Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Marcus Delacroix had patrolled the ranch roads of Bezar County, Texas for 19 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a routine missing person case and something that would keep him awake for weeks. The call that came in on a humid August morning in 2019 fell squarely into the latter category, though he wouldn't understand the full scope of what they were dealing with until bodies started turning up in shallow graves across 3 counties. "Sheriff, we got a situation out on the old Mathis Ranch." Deputy Elena Vasquez's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident despite her usual professional composure. Rancher found an abandoned vehicle on one of his back roads. Drivers nowhere to be found. But there's something else. You need to see this yourself. Sheriff Delacroix was finishing his morning coffee at Rosa's Cafe in downtown Floresville when the call came in. At 53, he was still lean and sharp-eyed, his weathered face bearing the lines of 2 decades spent under the brutal South Texas sun. He'd seen enough missing person cases to know that the first few hours were critical, and something in Deputy Vasquez's voice told him this wasn't going to be a simple case of a stranded motorist walking to find help. "I'm 20 minutes out," he radioed back, already heading for his cruiser. "Secure the scene and don't let anyone contaminate it. And Elena, call in Deputy Morrison and have him bring the camera equipment." The drive to the Mathis Ranch took him through the heart of rural Bezar County, past sprawling spreads where Black Angus cattle grazed under mesquite trees, and oil pumps nodded rhythmically in the distance. This was old Texas, where some families had been working the same land for generations, and where everyone knew their neighbor's business. It was also country where a person could disappear without a trace if they weren't careful about where they wandered. The Mathis property stretched across 12,000 acres of South Texas rangeland, a patchwork of pastures, mesquite groves, and cattle trails that hadn't changed much since the 1800s. Old Jack Mathis had inherited the spread from his father and grandfather before him, running Brahmin cattle and leasing hunting rights to city folks who wanted to experience rural Texas for a weekend. Sheriff Delacroix had responded to calls out there before, mostly cattle rustling, occasional trespassing, the kind of rural crime that came with operating one of the largest spreads in the county. Nothing that had prepared him for what Deputy Vasquez was about to show him. The abandoned vehicle sat in a cloud of dust where the main ranch road branched off toward the eastern pastures, about 5 miles from the highway and 2 miles from the Mathis house. A white Toyota Camry with Louisiana plates, engine still ticking as it cooled in the morning heat. The driver's door hung open, keys dangling from the ignition like the occupant had just stepped out for a moment. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder next to a road atlas open to Texas highways, the pages fluttering in the warm breeze. "Belongs to Patricia Kellum," Deputy Vasquez reported, consulting her notepad as Sheriff Delacroix approached. 43 years old, registered address in Shreveport. According to her sister, she was driving to San Antonio for a job interview yesterday. Never made it to her hotel. Sheriff Delacroix walked a slow circle around the vehicle, noting the details that would matter later. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no dents, no scratches that might indicate forced entry or an accident. The car was clean, well-maintained, with Louisiana inspection and registration stickers that were current. Purse still on the passenger seat, a black leather handbag that looked expensive. Wallet intact inside with $47 cash and credit cards that appeared untouched. cell phone plugged into the charger, showing 17 missed calls from someone listed as Jenny's sister. The car's air conditioning was still running when they'd arrived, suggesting Patricia had left the vehicle very recently, possibly within the last hour or two. "What time did Mattis find it?" Sheriff Delacroix asked, taking photographs of the scene from multiple angles. "Around 7:30 this morning. Says he was checking on cattle in the east pasture when he spotted it. Thought maybe someone had car trouble, so he drove over to offer help. When he saw it was empty with the door open, he called us right away." "And what did you mean there was something else?" Deputy Vasquez pointed toward a metal gate about 50 yards from where the car sat. The gate was painted green, weathered but sturdy, designed to keep cattle from wandering between pastures. Cattle gate was standing wide open when we got here. Old man Mathis swears he closed it yesterday evening like he always does. Says he's been working this ranch for 43 years and never left a gate open overnight. Claims if you leave gates open, cattle will wander and you'll spend days rounding them up. The gate opened onto what locals called the livestock roads, a network of narrow dirt tracks that crisscross the ranch, connecting pastures and watering holes used for moving cattle between grazing areas. Most of the roads were barely wide enough for a pickup truck, winding through dense brush and mesquite thickets that could hide a person, or a predator, completely from view. The roads had been carved out decades ago by cattle and ranch vehicles, creating a maze of interconnected paths that even experienced ranchers sometimes got lost in. Sheriff Delacroix studied the ground near the gate, dropping to one knee to examine the hard-packed earth more closely. The area showed tire tracks from ranch vehicles, the distinctive deep tread of pickup trucks and tractors that had passed through recently. But there were also footprints. 2 distinct sets, he noticed, preserved in a patch of softer soil near the gate post. One belonged to work boots, heavy tread, consistent with a rancher or cowboy, size 10 or 11. The other was smaller, lighter. Women's sneakers with a distinctive waffle pattern that matched the athletic shoes visible on the floorboard of Patricia's car. "Patricia's prints?" he asked Deputy Vasquez. "That's what we're thinking. They lead through the gate and down that livestock road there. We followed them maybe 100 yards before they disappeared on some rocky ground. Didn't want to go further without you here." Sheriff Delacroix felt that familiar tightness in his chest that came with cases that didn't add up logically. A woman driving to San Antonio for a job interview doesn't park her car on a ranch road and walk through a cattle gate into the middle of nowhere. Not unless someone convinced her to do it, and the reasons for that were rarely good. He'd seen enough predators in his career to know they were often clever, patient, and skilled at manipulating their victims into vulnerable positions. "Did Mathis see anything last night? Hear anything unusual?" "Says he was in his house watching TV until around 10:30, then went to bed. House is about 2 miles from here, so he wouldn't have heard much unless someone was shooting or screaming. Claims he didn't see any other vehicles on his property, but admits he doesn't patrol the back roads at night unless there's a specific problem." Sheriff Delacroix made notes in his pad, sketching a rough diagram of the scene and noting the positions of evidence. The morning was already heating up, promising another scorching day in the high 90s. He needed to get a search organized quickly, before the heat made extended outdoor work dangerous for his deputies and volunteers. "Call dispatch and have them contact Texas Rangers headquarters in Austin. Let them know we have a possible abduction in progress and might need additional resources. Also, get me contact information for Patricia Kellum's sister in Louisiana. I want to know everything about Patricia's travel plans, who she might have been in contact with, any reason someone might want to harm her." By noon, Sheriff Delacroix had organized a comprehensive search party. The Bexar County Sheriff's Department didn't have unlimited resources. His entire force consisted of 12 full-time deputies, 6 part-time officers, and himself. But a missing person case involving potential foul play warranted bringing in additional help. He called up volunteer searchers from the local ranching community, men and women who knew the country and could navigate the maze of livestock roads without getting lost themselves. Jim Morrison, a retired Border Patrol agent who now trained tracking dogs for search and rescue operations, arrived with 2 German Shepherds experienced in finding missing persons. Sarah Chen, a Texas Ranger with expertise in rural crime, drove down from San Antonio to advise on the investigation. The Department of Public Safety provided a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance, though the thick mesquite canopy would limit its effectiveness in many areas. "What's the layout of these livestock roads?" Ranger Chen asked, studying a map of the Matis property spread across the hood of her patrol car. "How extensive is this network?" "Goes on for miles," Sheriff Delacroix explained, tracing routes with his finger. "Connects to neighboring ranches, too. The Gonzalez place to the south, the old Martinez property to the east, the Murphy spread to the north. Someone who knows these roads could travel for 20 or 30 miles without ever hitting a paved highway." The search began systematically, with teams assigned to different sections of the livestock road network. Handler Morrison worked his dogs along the route where Patricia's footprints had been found, while other teams spread out to cover adjacent roads and trails. The volunteers, mostly local ranchers and their cowboys, provided invaluable knowledge about the terrain and the location of abandoned structures, stock tanks, and other landmarks where someone might be hiding or where evidence might be found. The dogs immediately picked up Patricia's scent along the livestock road that led east from the gate. The trail was strong at first, indicating she had passed this way recently, probably within the last 12 to 18 hours based on the dog's behavior. But as they followed the scent deeper into the ranch, it began to fragment in ways that troubled Handler Morrison. "This is unusual," he explained to Sheriff Delacroix as they watched the dogs work. "They're picking up her scent, but it keeps splitting and rejoining, like she traveled this route multiple times, or was moved back and forth along the same roads. Could indicate someone was deliberately trying to confuse a tracking effort." After 2 hours of following the dogs through increasingly dense brush, they reached an intersection where 4 different livestock roads converged around a large stock tank built for watering cattle. The concrete structure was about 20 feet across and 6 feet deep, filled with brackish water that reflected the afternoon sky like a dark mirror. Windmill pumps nearby kept it supplied with groundwater drawn from deep aquifers that had sustained ranching in this area for over a century. Here, the dogs became agitated, circling the area and whining in a way that indicated they had found something significant. Patricia's scent was strong around the stock tank, but it seemed to lead in multiple directions at once. Handler Morrison worked the dogs carefully around the perimeter of the concrete structure, looking for clues about what had happened here. "She definitely spent time at this location," Morrison reported. "But there's something else. The dogs are picking up another scent, human, but not Patricia. Male, I'd guess, based on their reaction pattern." Sheriff Delacroix studied the ground around the stock tank, looking for footprints or other physical evidence. The area was heavily traveled by cattle, churned up by hooves and disturbed by ranch vehicles, making it difficult to identify specific tracks. But near the windmill that supplied water to the tank, he found something that made his pulse quicken. Cigarette butts. 4 of them, all the same brand, Marlboro Reds, discarded near the base of the windmill structure. They looked recent, not weathered by exposure to sun and rain like trash that had been there for weeks or months. Someone had spent time here recently, smoking and waiting. Watching, perhaps. "Bag these," he told Deputy Vasquez, pointing to the cigarette butts. "Full forensic workup, DNA, fingerprints, anything that might give us an identification. As the afternoon wore on, the search teams explored dozens of miles of livestock roads, following every branch and intersection in an expanding pattern around the stock tank where the dogs had found concentrated scent evidence. The terrain was challenging. Dense mesquite and prickly pear cactus lined most roads, creating natural corridors that limited visibility and made it easy for someone to set up ambush points or observation posts. Deputy Martinez, working the southern section with a group of volunteer ranchers, made the next significant discovery. Following a livestock road that curved toward the boundary with the Gonzalez Ranch, they found Patricia's cell phone lying in the dirt beside a cattle guard, a metal grate designed to prevent livestock from crossing between properties without requiring gates. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Deputy Martinez radioed. "Found the missing woman's phone about 3 miles southeast of the stock tank. Device appears intact but has some damage to the screen." Sheriff Delacroix and Ranger Chen drove to the location, navigating the narrow dirt road carefully to avoid damaging their vehicles on rocks or in the deep ruts carved by heavy ranch trucks. The cell phone lay partially hidden under a clump of dried grass near the cattle guard, as if it had been thrown there hastily or dropped accidentally. "Screen's cracked, but the phone's still functional," Ranger Chen observed, examining the device carefully before bagging it as evidence. "Battery's at about 30%, so it's been active recently." "What's the call log show?" Sheriff Delacroix asked. Chen scrolled through Patricia's recent calls, noting the pattern of activity in the hours before her disappearance. Most calls were routine. Conversations with her sister, a few work-related numbers, her hotel in San Antonio confirming her reservation for the previous night. But one call stood out as anomalous. "Last outgoing call was at 9:47 p.m. yesterday," Chen reported. "Duration shows 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Number's local, someone in this county. But when I try calling it back, I get a recording saying the number's been disconnected." Sheriff Delacroix felt his investigative instincts sharpening. "What's the number?" 830555047. Landline based on the exchange, but there's something else. Chen frowned at the phone's display. According to the call log, Patricia received an incoming call from the same number at 9:43 p.m., just 4 minutes before she called back. Someone contacted her first, then she returned the call. The pattern suggested that someone had reached out to Patricia while she was traveling, possibly claiming to offer assistance or information about her route. Rural Texas was notorious for dead zones where cell service was spotty, and travelers often found themselves relying on the kindness of strangers when their GPS systems failed, or they became confused about directions. "Run that number through our database," Sheriff Delacroix ordered. "I want to know who had that line, when it was disconnected, who might have access to it now. Also, check with the phone company about the location of the nearest cell tower. If Patricia was talking to someone when her phone was in this area, we can narrow down where the conversation took place." As evening approached and the temperature began to drop from the day's brutal high, they established a command post at the Mathis Ranch house. Jack Mathis, a weathered man in his 70s with hands gnarled by decades of ranch work, provided coffee and local knowledge about the maze of roads that crisscrossed his property and connected to neighboring ranches. "Been running cattle on this land since 1976, Mathis explained, pointing to locations on a detailed survey map spread across his kitchen table. "My daddy bought this place in 1952, and his daddy homesteaded part of it back in the 1920s. Every road, every stock tank, every line shack. I know it all like the back of my hand." "These roads here," Sheriff Delacroix said, indicating the eastern section where Patricia's trail had been found. "Where do they connect to?" They tie into the old Martinez place, Matas replied. Property's been abandoned for maybe 15 years since the family moved to Houston after old Carlos died. House is still standing, barn too, but nobody's lived there in years. County's been trying to collect back taxes on it, but the heirs keep fighting it in court. How far is that from where we found Patricia's car? Maybe 3 miles following the main livestock road, but there are shortcuts through the brush that cut it down to 2 miles or less. Rough country, though, especially at night. Lots of places to get lost if you don't know where you're going. I've had to search for lost hunters in that area more than once. Deputy Vasquez returned from running the mysterious phone number through their computer systems with information that sent a chill down Sheriff Delacroix's spine. Number was registered to a landline at the Martinez property, she reported. Service was disconnected 14 years ago when the family moved away and stopped paying the bills. But here's the thing, Sheriff. According to the phone company's automated systems, that line showed activity yesterday night. Somehow, someone was using a disconnected number to make and receive calls. The pieces of the puzzle began forming a disturbing picture in Sheriff Delacroix's mind. Patricia Kellum, lost on dark ranch roads while traveling to an important job interview, had somehow been contacted by someone using a phone line that had been officially disconnected for over a decade. Someone who knew she was in the area, who had her cell phone number, and who had convinced her to leave the safety of her vehicle and walk deeper into ranch country where help might be hours away. That's not possible with normal equipment, Ranger Chen observed. But with the right electronics knowledge, someone could potentially restore service to a disconnected line, at least temporarily, or set up a system that makes calls appear to originate from that number while actually coming from somewhere else. We need to get to the Martinez place first thing in the morning, Sheriff Delacroix decided. Full tactical response. If someone's using that property as a base of operations, we need to approach with extreme caution. The abandoned Martinez homestead sat in a clearing surrounded by dense mesquite and prickly pear, connected to the main ranch roads by a winding track that hadn't seen regular maintenance since the family had moved away. The house was a modest ranch-style structure from the 1960s, built of native limestone with a red tile roof. Its white paint was now faded and peeling. Windows dark and empty like vacant eyes staring across the overgrown yard. A collapsed barn and several outbuildings completed the picture of rural decay that was all too common across Texas as farming and ranching operations consolidated and small family spreads were abandoned. Sheriff Delacroix led a team of 6 deputies in 3 vehicles, approaching the property carefully at dawn with weapons ready and body armor secured. They had no idea what they might find. A person holding Patricia captive, evidence of foul play, or simply another dead end in what was becoming an increasingly complex investigation. The morning air was cool and still, carrying the scent of sage and mesquite flowers that would soon be replaced by the oppressive heat of another August day. The front door of the house stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the morning breeze that stirred the dry grass around the foundation. Someone had been here recently. That much was immediately obvious from the footprints in the accumulated dust on the front porch and the tire tracks in the dirt yard that were too fresh to have been made by the Martinez family years ago. Bexar County Sheriff's Department, Delacroix called out in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the clearing. If anyone's inside, come out with your hands visible. No response. Only the sound of wind through the mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle in the pastures beyond. After waiting several minutes for any sign of occupancy, the team approached the house systematically, checking windows and possible escape routes before entering through the front door. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, carrying the musty odor of a house that had been closed up for years. But recent footprints in the accumulated dirt on the floors showed clearly that someone had been living here, at least intermittently. The footprints were large, consistent with work boots, and followed a pattern through the house that suggested familiarity with the layout. "Someone's been staying here," Deputy Martinez observed, photographing the footprint evidence. "Looks like they've been using the back bedroom and the kitchen, primarily." In the kitchen, they found their first major piece of evidence. On the counter sat an old rotary telephone, the kind that had been standard in rural homes for decades before the widespread adoption of modern push-button and cordless models. The phone was black, heavy, and showed signs of recent maintenance or modification. When Deputy Vasquez lifted the receiver, she could hear a dial tone. Impossible for a line that had been disconnected 14 years ago. "This is definitely not standard equipment," Ranger Chen observed, examining the phone more closely. "Someone's modified the wiring, probably connected it to some kind of electronics that can generate a dial tone and place calls through a different routing system." Sheriff Delacroix felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to connect. So, someone could make calls that appeared to come from this disconnected number, even though the original phone service was cut off years ago. Exactly. With the right equipment, they could intercept calls, monitor local phone traffic, even make it look like calls were coming from specific numbers. It's not sophisticated technology anymore. You can buy components online or at electronics stores. In the living room, they found evidence that someone had been using the abandoned house as more than just a temporary shelter. A sleeping bag was spread in one corner next to a battery-powered radio and several bottles of water. Canned food was stacked neatly on makeshift shelves built from concrete blocks and old boards. Most disturbing was a collection of road atlases and topographic maps spread across an old coffee table, marked extensively with red ink to show routes through rural counties across South Texas. "Look at these markings," Sheriff Delacroix said, studying the maps carefully. "These aren't just random roads. They're all rural roads, ranch roads, places where someone traveling alone might get lost or confused about directions." Deputy Vasquez pointed to specific markings on the maps. "And look here. These red circles correspond to locations where we've had reports of abandoned vehicles over the past few years, cases where drivers just seemed to disappear." The realization hit Sheriff Delacroix like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with a single incident involving Patricia Kellum. They were looking at evidence of a systematic operation targeting travelers on rural Texas roads, possibly spanning years and multiple victims. "Bag everything," he ordered. "Every map, every piece of paper, every modification to that phone system. We need forensic analysis of all of it." Deputy Martinez, exploring the back of the house, made a discovery that transformed the investigation from a missing person case to something much darker. Hidden under a loose floorboard in what had once been a child's bedroom, he found a wooden cigar box containing dozens of driver's licenses. The licenses belonged to women ranging in age from 25 to 55, all with out-of-state addresses: Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Martinez called, his voice tight with tension. "I count 37 licenses here. Different states, different years going back at least 5 years. But they all have one thing in common. They're all women, and none of them are from Texas." Sheriff Delacroix felt that familiar cold sensation that came with realizing they were dealing with something far worse than anyone had initially suspected. 37 driver's licenses represented 37 potential victims, 37 families who might have lost someone to whatever predator had been operating from this abandoned ranch house. "Photograph each license individually, then bag them for evidence," he instructed. "We need to run every name through missing persons databases nationwide, and I want this entire property treated as a crime scene until we know exactly what we're dealing with." The search of the Martinez property revealed additional evidence of a sophisticated and long-term operation. In the barn, which had appeared collapsed from a distance but was actually structurally sound, they found a workspace that had been used for automotive maintenance. Tire tracks in the dirt floor, oil stains, and tools arranged with the precision of someone who worked on vehicles regularly. Multiple license plates from different states were stacked in one corner, suggesting that whoever was using this facility had the ability to change vehicle identification quickly. A shed behind the house contained what appeared to be an electronics workshop, with equipment for modifying radio and telephone systems. Circuit boards, antenna arrays, and testing equipment were organized on a workbench that had been built from sawhorses and plywood. Technical manuals dealing with telecommunications and radio frequency equipment provided insight into the sophistication of the operation. Most chilling was the discovery in an underground root cellar that had been expanded and modified into something resembling a bunker or survival shelter. The space contained camping equipment, medical supplies including IV bags and surgical instruments, and detailed notes about traffic patterns on rural highways throughout South Texas. Charts showed the timing of law enforcement patrols, the locations of cell phone towers, and the schedules of various government agencies that might respond to emergency calls. This person's been planning and preparing for years, Ranger Chen observed as they cataloged the evidence. This isn't impulsive criminal behavior. Someone's been systematically studying our response procedures, learning how we operate, identifying vulnerabilities in rural law enforcement. Sheriff Delacroix nodded grimly, and using that knowledge to hunt people. The question is, where are the victims? 37 driver's licenses, but we haven't found any bodies. The answer to that question would come over the following days as the investigation expanded beyond the Martinez property. Each driver's license represented a potential case that needed to be investigated, and running the names through national databases revealed a horrifying pattern. Over the past 5 years, 18 of the women whose licenses they had found had been reported missing while traveling through Texas or neighboring states. Their vehicles had been found abandoned on rural roads, but the women themselves had never been located. We're looking at a serial predator who's been operating across multiple states for years, FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres explained during a briefing at the Bexar County Sheriff's Department. Agent Torres specialized in cases involving interstate crime and had been called in when the scope of the investigation became clear. The methodology is sophisticated, targeting women traveling alone, intercepting them on remote roads, using deception to get them to abandon their vehicles. But how? Deputy Vasquez asked. We're not seeing signs of forced abduction. No damaged vehicles, no evidence of violence at the initial contact points. Agent Torres pulled out a thick file folder containing reports from similar cases across the Southwest. We believe he's using a combination of electronic deception and psychological manipulation. The modified phone equipment suggests he can intercept cell phone signals, monitor emergency services radio traffic, possibly even impersonate legitimate authorities. Imagine you're lost on a dark ranch road, your GPS isn't working properly, and someone calls claiming to be a deputy sheriff or highway patrolman offering to help. Someone who seems to know exactly where you are and sounds completely official. The psychological profile that emerged was terrifying in its implications. They were dealing with someone intelligent enough to modify sophisticated electronic equipment, patient enough to establish long-term operational bases at abandoned properties, knowledgeable about law enforcement procedures and radio protocols, and ruthless enough to target vulnerable travelers systematically over a period of years. Sheriff Delacroix coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Texas and neighboring states to search for similar patterns of abandoned vehicles and missing persons. The scope of the operation became apparent as reports came in from rural counties throughout the region. Abandoned cars on ranch roads, missing women, mysterious phone calls from disconnected numbers. The same pattern repeated across hundreds of miles of rural highways. He's mobile, Agent Torres concluded after reviewing the accumulated evidence, using different abandoned properties as temporary bases of operation, probably moving every few months to avoid detection. The rural road network gives him perfect hunting grounds. Isolated areas where he can work without witnesses, properties that haven't been occupied in years, providing ready-made facilities. The breakthrough in identifying their suspect came when forensic analysis of the phone equipment revealed crucial information. The modified electronics contained serial numbers that could be traced back to purchases made at different stores across 3 states over a 2-year period. All had been bought with cash, but security footage from an electronics store in Austin showed a clear image of the buyer making one of the purchases. The man appeared to be in his 40s, average height and build, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing particularly remarkable about him except for one distinguishing feature that would prove crucial for identification: a distinctive scar running along his left jawline, the kind that might result from a serious accident, assault, or surgical procedure. Circulate this image to every law enforcement agency in Texas and surrounding states, Sheriff Delacroix ordered. Someone's going to recognize this guy. Scars like that are memorable, and he's probably been living and working in rural communities where people notice newcomers. The identification came from an unexpected source 3 days later. A retired deputy from Uvalde County, 2 counties west of Besar, called after seeing the image in a law enforcement bulletin distributed through the Texas Sheriff's Association network. "That's Bobby Ray Hutchins," Deputy Frank Morales said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had dealt with the suspect personally. "Arrested him maybe 8 years ago for cattle rustling and criminal trespass. Had that exact same scar from a truck accident when he was young. Rolled an 18-wheeler on I-35 back in the 90s. Last I heard, he was picking up work on ranches around South Texas. Knew the country better than most locals. Bobby Ray Hutchins." The name went immediately into state and federal databases, pulling up a criminal record that painted a picture of a man who had been escalating his criminal behavior for decades. Property crimes in his 20s, burglary, theft, criminal trespass, cattle rustling, and agricultural theft in his 30s. Several arrests for stalking and harassment, though the charges had been dropped when victims failed to cooperate with prosecution. Most recently, arrests for trespassing on ranch property and what investigating officers had described as suspicious behavior around livestock sales and cattle auctions. What made Hutchins particularly dangerous was his intimate knowledge of rural Texas gained through years of legitimate and illegitimate work on ranches across the region. He had been employed as a cowboy, equipment operator, and general laborer on dozens of spreads, learning the layout of remote properties, the schedules of ranch operations, and the patterns of traffic on rural roads. He knew which properties were abandoned, which roads were rarely patrolled by law enforcement, and which areas provided perfect concealment for criminal activity. He knows every back road, every abandoned homestead, every place where someone could disappear without a trace, Sheriff Delacroix told the multi-agency task force that had assembled to coordinate the manhunt. And he's been using that knowledge systematically to hunt people for years. The search for Bobby Ray Hutchins involved law enforcement agencies across multiple states and covered thousands of square miles of rural territory. Based on the evidence found at the Martinez property and analysis of the driver's licenses in his possession, investigators identified 23 additional abandoned properties where he might be operating. Each location had to be searched carefully and treated as a potential crime scene containing evidence of years of predatory activity. Agent Torres coordinated the effort from a command post established at the Bezar County Sheriff's Department, using sophisticated computer mapping to track the connections between confirmed sightings, abandoned properties, and reports of missing persons. The pattern that emerged showed Hutchins moving systematically through rural Texas, establishing temporary bases at abandoned ranches and farmhouses, then hunting in the surrounding area before moving on to avoid detection. "He's not random," Torres explained to the assembled investigators. "There's a clear methodology to his movements. He selects properties that are isolated but still connected to road networks, places where he can intercept travelers but still have escape routes if law enforcement gets close. And he's been doing this long enough to understand our response procedures." The arrest came 3 weeks after they had identified Hutchins, when a Border Patrol agent conducting routine traffic enforcement near Laredo spotted a pickup truck matching the description of Hutchins' last known vehicle. The truck was parked at a rest stop on Highway 83, a lonely stretch of road that connected small towns along the Rio Grande Valley. Agent Maria Santos approached the vehicle carefully, noting that the driver appeared to be sleeping in the cab. When she tapped on the window and identified herself, the man inside, later confirmed to be Bobby Ray Hutchins, showed no surprise or attempt to flee. He simply rolled down the window and asked, "Y'all finally figured it out, did you?" Inside Hutchins' vehicle, investigators found evidence that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of his criminal operation. Maps marked with routes through rural counties across 3 states. A collection of cell phones that forensic analysis would later connect to several of his victims. Equipment for intercepting and redirecting radio communications that would allow him to monitor law enforcement traffic and potentially impersonate official responders. Most disturbing was a detailed journal in which Hutchins had methodically documented his activities over several years. The entries revealed not just the locations and methods of his crimes, but his psychological state and motivation. He had been systematically hunting women travelers, using his knowledge of rural Texas to intercept them in areas where help was hours away, and where their disappearances might not be noticed immediately. "Called them road angels," Hutchins explained during his initial interrogation, showing no remorse for his actions. Women driving alone through country they didn't know, trusting their GPS and cell phones to keep them safe. "I was just showing them how vulnerable they really were out there." The journal entries revealed Hutchins's methodology in disturbing detail. He would monitor emergency services radio traffic, positioning himself to intercept calls for help or to arrive at scenes before legitimate responders. He had studied law enforcement procedures and radio protocols, learning enough to sound convincing when impersonating deputies or highway patrol officers. His knowledge of rural road networks allowed him to direct victims to increasingly isolated locations where he could work without interference. He would tell them he was responding to their emergency call, Agent Torres explained during a press briefing, or claim to be checking on reports of problems in their area. He sounded official, knew enough procedure to be convincing, and most importantly, he seemed to have information about their specific situation that made him seem legitimate. The search for Hutchins' victims led investigators to multiple locations across South Texas and beyond. At an abandoned ranch house near Crystal City, they found evidence of recent habitation in what appeared to be a holding area where victims might have been kept temporarily. The location included restraints, basic medical supplies, and more detailed maps marking specific routes and timing information for law enforcement patrols. At another site near Carrizo Springs, closer to the Mexican border, cadaver dogs alerted on disturbed ground behind a collapsed barn. The excavation that followed revealed the horrific truth about what had happened to at least some of Hutchins' victims. Over several days, investigators recovered the remains of 9 women, all consistent with the driver's licenses found in his possession at the Martinez property. Forensic examination of the remains indicated they had been killed at different times over a period of several years, confirming that Hutchins had been operating as a serial killer for much longer than anyone had initially suspected. The condition of the remains and evidence found at the burial sites suggested that some victims had been held for days or weeks before being killed, during which time Hutchins had apparently subjected them to prolonged psychological torture. Patricia Kellum was found alive. The discovery came at a remote hunting cabin on private land near the Rio Grande, approximately 60 miles from where her car had been abandoned at the Mattis Ranch. Acting on information extracted from Hutchins' journal and GPS data recovered from his vehicle, Sheriff Delacroix led a joint task force to the location on a sweltering afternoon in late August, nearly a month after Patricia's initial disappearance. The cabin sat in a grove of ancient live oak trees, hidden from view by thick brush, and accessible only by a barely visible track that wound through mesquite and prickly pear for over 2 miles from the nearest maintained road. The structure was small but well-maintained, clearly used regularly for hunting or as a retreat. Solar panels provided electricity, and a water well supplied basic utilities. Bexar County Sheriff's Department, Delacroix called out as his team surrounded the cabin. "We have a warrant to search these premises. If anyone's inside, come out immediately with your hands visible." The response came not from inside the cabin, but from a storage shed about 50 yards away, a weak voice calling for help. Patricia Kellum was found inside the shed, secured with restraints but alive, dehydrated and traumatized, but physically unharmed after nearly 4 weeks in captivity. "He said he was deciding what to do with me," Patricia later told investigators after being treated at a San Antonio hospital. "Kept talking about how I needed to understand the truth about traveling alone, about how dangerous the roads really were. He seemed to enjoy the psychological control, making me believe I might survive if I cooperated with his lessons." Patricia's account revealed the full scope of Hutchins' psychological methodology. He didn't simply kill his victims immediately after capturing them. Instead, he had developed an elaborate system of psychological manipulation designed to break down their sense of security and self-reliance before ultimately deciding their fate. Some victims he released in remote areas where they died of exposure or dehydration. Others he killed directly after his period of instruction was complete. A few, like Patricia, he kept for extended periods while he refined his techniques. He called himself the shepherd of the livestock roads, Patricia testified during Hutchins's eventual trial, her voice steady despite the obvious trauma of recounting her experience. Said the highways were his pasture and travelers were his flock. He believed he was providing some kind of service by teaching people about their vulnerability. The psychological evaluation conducted during Hutchins's pretrial proceedings revealed a complex individual whose criminal behavior had evolved over decades from simple property crimes to elaborate psychological torture and murder. Dr. James Richardson, a forensic psychiatrist with extensive experience in serial killer cases, described Hutchins as an organized, methodical predator who had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for hunting and controlling victims. Hutchins exhibits classic characteristics of what we call a mission-oriented serial killer, Dr. Richardson explained during court proceedings. He genuinely believes he's providing a service to society by exposing the dangers of rural travel. His journal entries show no remorse for his actions, but rather pride in his ability to demonstrate what he sees as important lessons about self-reliance and preparedness. The trial of Bobby Ray Hutchins became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in South Texas history. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Santos, presented evidence linking him to 11 confirmed murders and 3 additional attempted murders, including the assault on Patricia Kellum. The case was complicated by the multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes, requiring coordination between prosecutors in 4 different counties and 2 states. Hutchins's defense attorney, Carlos Mendoza, attempted to argue that his client suffered from delusional thinking, brought on by years of isolation and substance abuse. The defense strategy focused on Hutchins' history of head injuries from his truck accident, and claimed that he genuinely believed he was helping his victims by teaching them survival skills. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. During the sentencing phase, Hutchins was given the opportunity to address the court. His statement revealed the depth of his disconnection from normal human empathy and his continued belief that his actions had been justified. People think they're safe out there in their cars with their cell phones and GPS systems, he told the packed courtroom, showing no emotion as family. Members of his victims wept in the gallery. Think technology will protect them from the realities of the world. I showed them the truth about how isolated they really were, how dependent they'd become on systems that can fail them when they need help most. He paused, looking directly at Patricia Kellum, who had chosen to attend the sentencing hearing despite the obvious emotional difficulty. I gave them knowledge they couldn't get any other way. Knowledge about their own limitations, about the dangers that exist beyond the reach of civilization. That's worth something, isn't it? Judge Maria Gonzalez sentenced Bobby Ray Hutchins to death by lethal injection for the capital murder charges, plus 11 consecutive life sentences for the additional homicides. In her sentencing statement, she addressed both the defendant and the packed courtroom with words that would be remembered long after the trial concluded. Mr. Hutchins, you have shown yourself to be a predator of the worst kind, Judge Gonzalez said, her voice carrying the weight of the community's outrage and grief. You exploited the isolation and vulnerability of innocent people, turning the very landscape of rural Texas into a hunting ground for your twisted psychological experiments. Your actions have forever changed how residents of this region view their own countryside. For Sheriff Delacroix, the successful prosecution of Bobby Ray Hutchins represented both a professional triumph and a personal reckoning with the realities of rural law enforcement. During the 3-month investigation, he had seen his jurisdiction transformed from a peaceful agricultural community into the hunting ground of a sophisticated predator who had exploited every weakness in their system. The case changed how I think about rural safety, Sheriff Delacroix reflected during an interview with the San Antonio Express-News several months after the trial. We always knew that help was far away on the ranch roads, that cell service was spotty, that there were places where someone could disappear without a trace. But we never considered that a predator might systematically exploit those vulnerabilities. The investigation had revealed disturbing gaps in coordination between rural law enforcement agencies, communication problems that allowed patterns of crime to go unnoticed across jurisdictional boundaries, and resource limitations that made it difficult to respond effectively to crimes occurring in remote areas. Sheriff Delacroix worked with other rural sheriffs throughout Texas to address these issues through improved information sharing and coordinated response protocols. The livestock roads are still there, he told a gathering of the Texas Sheriff's Association during their annual conference. The abandoned properties, the dead zones for cell coverage, the places where someone can work without witnesses. We caught Bobby Ray Hutchins, but the infrastructure he exploited remains. We need to think differently about how we protect people in rural areas. The case led to significant changes in how missing persons cases were handled across rural Texas. New protocols required immediate notification of adjacent counties when vehicles were found abandoned on remote roads. Cell phone companies were pressured to improve coverage in rural areas, and GPS services were updated to include warnings about traveling alone on isolated routes. The Texas Department of Public Safety established a specialized unit focused on rural highway crimes, with particular attention to patterns that might indicate serial predation. The unit maintained a database of abandoned vehicle reports, missing persons cases, and suspicious activities that allowed investigators to identify connections across jurisdictional boundaries much more quickly than had been possible during the Hutchins investigation. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. The case had shattered the assumption, deeply held by many rural Texans, that country roads were inherently safer than urban areas. The image of Texas as a place where neighbors looked out for each other, and where help was always available, had been complicated by the realization that predators could exploit the very isolation that many residents found appealing. What made Bobby Ray Hutchins so effective wasn't his violence, Sheriff Delacroix explained during a training seminar for rural law enforcement officers. It was his patience and his understanding of how we operate. He spent years learning our procedures, our response times, our communication protocols. He turned our own rural culture, the willingness to help strangers, the trust in authority figures, the assumption that isolation meant safety, against his victims. The Martinez property, where the investigation had its breakthrough, was eventually demolished by court order. The buildings razed and the land sold to pay restitution to victims' families. Local ranchers reported that cattle continued to avoid the area where the house had stood, as if the animals could sense something lingering in the soil where so much planning for violence had taken place. For the families of Hutchins' victims, the conclusion of the case brought a form of closure, though the pain of their losses would never fully heal. Many had spent years not knowing what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers who had simply vanished while traveling through Texas. The discovery of remains and the conviction of their killer provided answers, but also confirmed their worst fears about how those they loved had died. "At least now we know," said Jennifer Kellum, Patricia's sister, during a victim impact statement at Hutchins' sentencing. "For 3 years, I wondered if maybe she had just decided to start a new life somewhere, if maybe she was still alive and would contact us someday. The truth is horrible, but not knowing was worse." Patricia Kellum herself became an advocate for traveler safety, working with law enforcement agencies to develop resources for people driving through remote areas. Her experience as Hutchins' captive provided unique insights into the psychology of predators who target travelers, and her survival made her a powerful voice for improved safety measures. Bobby Ray Hutchins succeeded because he understood something that most people don't want to think about, Patricia explained during a presentation to a conference of victim advocates. When you're traveling alone on rural roads, you're completely dependent on the goodwill of strangers if something goes wrong. He exploited that dependency by positioning himself as someone offering help while actually being the greatest danger I could have encountered. The broader implications of the Hutchins case extended far beyond Texas. Law enforcement agencies throughout the rural United States began examining their own procedures for handling missing persons cases and coordinating information across jurisdictional boundaries. The case became a standard example in training programs for rural police and sheriff's departments, illustrating how serial predators could exploit the unique vulnerabilities of sparsely populated areas. Dr. Richardson, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Hutchins, published a comprehensive study of the case that became required reading in criminal justice programs. His analysis focused on how the isolation of rural areas could create perfect conditions for certain types of predatory behavior, particularly when combined with predators who possessed detailed knowledge of local geography and law enforcement procedures. The Hutchins case represents a new category of serial predation, Dr. Richardson wrote in his published study. Traditional serial killers often operate in urban areas where they can blend into large populations and where the frequency of violent crime provides cover for their activities. Hutchins demonstrated that rural areas offer different but equally significant advantages: isolation, limited law enforcement resources, and populations that are accustomed to helping strangers. The case also prompted changes in how technology companies approached rural safety. GPS navigation systems were updated to provide warnings when routes would take drivers through areas with limited cell coverage or emergency services. Satellite communication devices became more affordable and accessible, giving travelers alternatives to cellular communication in remote areas. Automotive manufacturers began including rural safety features as standard equipment, such as enhanced GPS tracking that could function even when cell service was unavailable, and emergency communication systems that could contact authorities through satellite networks. These changes were often marketed as ranch road safety packages, a direct reference to the terminology that had emerged from the Hutchins case. Sheriff Delacroix continued serving Bexar County until his retirement in 2023. But the Hutchins investigation remained the defining case of his career. He frequently spoke at law enforcement conferences and training seminars, sharing lessons learned from the investigation and advocating for improved coordination between rural agencies. The most important lesson from the Bobby Ray Hutchins case, he would tell audiences of law enforcement officers, is that rural areas aren't immune from sophisticated criminal activity. We can't assume that our remoteness provides protection when that same remoteness can be weaponized by someone who understands how to exploit it. In his final interview with the local newspaper before retirement, Sheriff Delacroix reflected on how the case had changed not just his approach to law enforcement, but his entire perspective on rural Texas life. I grew up believing that country people looked out for each other, that isolation meant safety from urban crime, that our biggest problems would be cattle rustling and domestic disputes. Bobby Ray Hutchins showed me that predators can adapt to any environment, and that rural areas have their own unique vulnerabilities that we ignored at our peril. The networks of ranch roads that crisscross rural Texas continue to serve their intended purpose, connecting pastures and facilitating the movement of cattle and agricultural equipment across vast distances. Ranchers still rely on these roads for their daily operations, and hunters and outdoor enthusiasts use them to access remote areas for recreation. But for those who know the story of Bobby Ray Hutchins and his victims, these dusty tracks serve as a constant reminder that predators have always been part of the pastoral landscape. They are patient and cunning, waiting for travelers who stray too far from the safety of civilization, ready to exploit the trust and vulnerability that are essential elements of rural community life. The livestock roads remain, winding through empty country under endless Texas skies, as beautiful and as treacherous as they have always been. They connect not just pastures and watering holes, but communities that have learned to balance their traditional hospitality with a new awareness of the dangers that can hide behind a helpful smile and an offer of assistance. Today, when travelers pass through rural Texas, they might notice increased law enforcement presence on remote highways and new emergency call boxes at isolated intersections. What they don't see are the improved communication systems that help coordinate search efforts, the databases that track patterns of abandoned vehicles and missing persons across jurisdictional boundaries, and the training programs that prepare rural officers to recognize the signs of predatory activity. The most lasting legacy of the Bobby Ray Hutchins case may be the understanding that rural safety requires the same level of vigilance and sophistication that has long been recognized as necessary in urban areas. The assumption that isolation provides protection has been replaced by the knowledge that isolation can be both a blessing and a vulnerability. Depending on who else knows about those lonely roads where help is far away and the only witnesses are cattle and coyotes. In the end, the case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can adapt to any environment, rural or urban, and that the price of safety is the same everywhere: constant vigilance, community cooperation, and the wisdom to know that not everyone who offers help has benevolent intentions. The livestock roads of Texas continue to connect communities and facilitate the movement of people and goods across vast distances. But they do so now with the understanding that some travelers who enter those dusty corridors may never find their way back to civilization. For Sheriff Marcus Delacroix, now enjoying retirement on a small ranch outside Floresville, the sound of cattle moving along the livestock roads outside his window carries both the comfort of familiar rural rhythms and the memory of how those same roads once served as hunting grounds for a predator who understood better than anyone else how to exploit the trust and isolation that define rural Texas life. The psychological aftermath of the Hutchins case extended far beyond the immediate investigation and trial. Deputy Elena Vasquez, who had been instrumental in the early stages of the investigation, found herself struggling with nightmares and hypervigilance that persisted for months after Hutchins's conviction. The realization that she had been patrolling roads where women were being systematically hunted had shaken her confidence in ways that traditional law enforcement training had not prepared her to handle. I kept thinking about all the abandoned vehicles I'd responded to over the years, Vasquez explained during a counseling session provided by the county's Employee Assistance Program. Calls where we assumed someone had just walked away for help or decided to leave their car behind. Now, I wondered how many of those might have been Hutchins's work. Cases where we didn't investigate thoroughly enough because we made assumptions about rural safety. The department implemented mandatory counseling for all officers who had been involved in the investigation, recognizing that exposure to evidence of systematic predation could have lasting psychological effects. Sheriff Delacroix himself struggled with questions about whether earlier intervention might have saved some of Hutchins's victims, despite reassurances from FBI profilers that the predator's methodology had been specifically designed to avoid detection. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Texas Ranger who had assisted with the investigation, conducted a comprehensive review of unsolved cases from the previous decade, looking for additional patterns that might indicate earlier Hutchins activity or the presence of other predators using similar techniques. Her analysis revealed disturbing trends in rural crime, reporting that suggested the Hutchins case might not be as isolated as law enforcement had hoped. We found at least 12 additional cases over the past 15 years that show similar characteristics, Dr. Chen reported to a joint meeting of sheriffs from across South Texas. Abandoned vehicles on rural roads, missing persons with out-of-state origins, evidence of electronic surveillance or communication interception. We can't definitively link them all to Hutchins, which raises the possibility that other predators have been using similar techniques. The revelation that Bobby Ray Hutchins might not have been operating alone, or that his methods might have inspired copycats, sent ripples of concern through rural law enforcement communities across Texas and beyond. The investigation expanded once again, this time focusing on identifying potential accomplices or imitators who might still be active. Analysis of Hutchins's journal revealed references to other individuals he had encountered during his years of drifting between ranch jobs. Some entries suggested he had shared information about vulnerable travelers and isolated locations with other transient workers, creating the possibility of a loose network of predators operating throughout the rural Southwest. He wrote about teaching others to see what I see, Agent Torres explained during a briefing with federal investigators. References to showing other people how easy it was to intercept travelers, how to identify vulnerable targets, how to avoid law enforcement detection. we're treating this as a potential conspiracy that may extend beyond Texas. The investigation into Hutchins's possible accomplices led to the arrest of 3 additional suspects over the following 18 months. 2 were transient ranch workers who had known Hutchins during his years of moving between agricultural jobs. Both had been involved in cattle rustling operations with him, and evidence suggested they had also participated in stalking and harassing women travelers, though neither was charged with murder. The 3rd suspect, however, proved to be far more significant. James Robert Jimmy Crawford was a former telecommunications technician who had been fired from his job with a rural phone company for unauthorized access to customer accounts and equipment. Analysis of phone records revealed that Crawford had been in contact with Hutchins over a period of several years, and that he had provided technical expertise for the electronic surveillance and communication interception equipment found at Hutchins's various operational bases. Crawford's arrest at a trailer park in Laredo led to the discovery of additional evidence that expanded the scope of the investigation once again. His residence contained detailed files on dozens of women who had traveled through the South Texas over the past decade, including photographs apparently taken without their knowledge, copies of their credit card and hotel records, and detailed notes about their travel patterns and personal habits. Crawford was the technical architect of the operation, Sheriff Delacroix explained during a press conference announcing the arrest. While Hutchins was the one who physically intercepted and harmed victims, Crawford provided the electronic surveillance capabilities that made the hunting process so efficient. He could track credit card usage, monitor cell phone communications, even access hotel reservation systems to identify women traveling alone. The collaboration between Hutchins and Crawford revealed a level of sophistication in rural predation that authorities had not previously encountered. Crawford's technical skills, combined with Hutchins' knowledge of rural geography and law enforcement procedures, had created a hunting system that could operate across vast areas with minimal risk of detection. Crawford's plea bargain testimony provided crucial information about the full scope of the conspiracy. He revealed that the partnership had been active for over 6 years, during which time they had systematically targeted women travelers throughout Texas, New Mexico, and parts of Oklahoma and Arkansas. Crawford estimated that they had surveilled over 200 potential victims, though only a fraction of those had actually been approached or harmed. We would identify women traveling alone through credit card monitoring and hotel records, Crawford testified during Hutchins' appeals hearing. I would track their movements electronically while Bobby positioned himself along their likely routes. If conditions were right, isolated location, poor cell coverage, no witnesses, he would make contact. Most of the time, we just watched and gathered information, but sometimes, Crawford's testimony confirmed law enforcement's worst fears about the systematic nature of the operation. The predators had been conducting what amounted to a research project on traveler vulnerability, testing different approaches and refining their techniques over years of observation and experimentation. The psychological evaluation of Crawford revealed a different personality profile from Hutchins. While Hutchins had been driven by a twisted sense of mission and a desire to demonstrate the dangers of rural travel, Crawford appeared motivated primarily by voyeuristic impulses and a fascination with surveillance technology. His pleasure came from the hunting process itself, the tracking, watching, and collection of information about unknowing victims. Crawford represents a new category of technology-enabled predator, explained Dr. Richardson during Crawford's sentencing hearing. He was able to extend traditional stalking behaviors across vast geographical areas using electronic surveillance techniques. His partnership with Hutchins demonstrates how dangerous such individuals can become when they collaborate with those willing to engage in physical violence. The discovery of the Hutchins-Crawford partnership prompted a comprehensive review of rural crime patterns throughout the American Southwest. Law enforcement agencies began sharing information more systematically, looking for evidence of similar technological approaches to predatory behavior. The investigation revealed that electronic surveillance of travelers was more common than previously realized, though most cases involved individual operators rather than organized partnerships. Federal legislation was introduced to address some of the vulnerabilities that the Hutchins case had exposed. The Rural Traveler Safety Act strengthened penalties for using electronic surveillance to target travelers, improved funding for emergency communication systems in remote areas, and established protocols for rapid information sharing between law enforcement agencies when patterns of predatory behavior were detected. The psychological impact on rural communities throughout Texas was profound and lasting. Many residents found themselves questioning assumptions about safety and community that had been fundamental to their way of life. The knowledge that predators had been systematically exploiting rural hospitality and trust created a climate of suspicion that took years to overcome. It changed how we interact with strangers, explained Maria Santos, a rancher whose property bordered one of Hutchins's operational areas. Used to be, if someone had car trouble or seemed lost, we'd offer help without thinking about it. Now, we're more careful, more suspicious. We still help people, but we do it differently. Call the sheriff first, make sure other people know what we're doing. Local businesses that catered to travelers also adapted their operations in response to the case. Gas stations and convenience stores in rural areas installed additional security cameras and improved lighting around their facilities. Many began offering traveler safety information, including maps showing cell phone coverage areas and locations of emergency services. The tourism industry in South Texas, which depended heavily on visitors from other states coming to experience ranch culture and outdoor recreation, initially suffered significant impacts from the negative publicity surrounding the case. Hotel bookings declined. Hunting and fishing guides reported fewer clients, and several annual festivals saw reduced attendance from out-of-state visitors. Recovery efforts focused on demonstrating that law enforcement had learned from the case and implemented improved safety measures. The Texas Department of Tourism worked with local sheriff's departments to develop traveler safety programs that provided information about rural travel precautions without discouraging visitation entirely. We had to find a balance, explained Tourism Director Robert Martinez. We couldn't pretend that rural travel was risk-free, but we also couldn't let fear prevent people from experiencing the authentic Texas that most of our state represents. The key was education and preparation rather than avoidance. The educational component included resources for travelers about recognizing potentially dangerous situations, maintaining communication with family and friends during travel, and understanding the limitations of technology in remote areas. GPS manufacturers were encouraged to include warnings about traveling in areas with limited emergency services, and several companies developed specialized applications for rural travel safety. Patricia Kellum's advocacy work became a central part of these educational efforts. Her first-hand experience as a victim provided credibility and urgency to safety messages that might otherwise have been dismissed as overly cautious. She worked with law enforcement agencies, tourism boards, and women's safety organizations to develop comprehensive resources for solo travelers. I don't want what happened to me to scare people away from traveling, Patricia explained during a presentation to a conference of travel industry professionals. But I do want people to understand that rural areas have different risks than urban areas, and that preparation and awareness can make the difference between a safe trip and a tragedy. Her advocacy led to the development of the Patricia Protocol, a set of safety procedures recommended for anyone traveling alone through rural areas. The protocol included requirements for sharing detailed itineraries with multiple contacts, checking in at regular intervals, carrying emergency communication devices, and following specific procedures if plans changed or problems arose. The protocol was endorsed by law enforcement agencies throughout Texas and eventually adopted by organizations in other states where similar rural travel risks existed. Several automotive manufacturers began including Patricia Protocol compliance features as standard equipment in vehicles marketed to rural and outdoor recreation customers. The long-term investigation into the Hutchins network continued for several years after the initial arrests, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify additional victims and determine the full scope of the conspiracy. Advanced forensic techniques were applied to evidence recovered from the various operational sites, revealing DNA and other trace evidence that could potentially be linked to additional cases. Cold case units throughout the Southwest reopened investigations into unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths that had occurred during the period when Hutchins and Crawford were known to be active. The process was painstaking and often inconclusive, but it did result in several additional cases being resolved, and some families finally receiving answers about the fates of missing loved ones. The technical aspects of Crawford's surveillance operation became the subject of extensive study by cybersecurity experts and law enforcement technology specialists. His methods for intercepting communications and accessing private databases revealed vulnerabilities in systems that many people had assumed were secure, leading to improved security protocols and monitoring procedures. Crawford demonstrated that someone with moderate technical skills and criminal intent could access far more personal information than most people realize, explained cybersecurity consultant David Park during a presentation to law enforcement professionals. His techniques weren't particularly sophisticated, but they were effective because the systems he was exploiting weren't designed to detect or prevent this type of misuse. The revelations about electronic surveillance capabilities available to predators prompted changes in how law enforcement agencies approached investigations involving missing persons and suspicious activities. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize signs of electronic surveillance and understand how predators might use technology to select and track victims. The broader implications of the case extended into discussions about privacy, security, and the balance between technological convenience and personal safety. The ease with which Crawford had been able to monitor travelers' movements and access their personal information raised questions about the security of systems that many people used daily without considering potential risks. Consumer advocacy groups used the case as an example of why stronger privacy protections and security measures were needed for credit card systems, hotel reservation databases, and telecommunications networks. Some of the reforms that resulted from these advocacy efforts included enhanced encryption for financial transactions, improved access controls for customer databases, and mandatory reporting of security breaches that might compromise personal information. The case also influenced academic research into the psychology of predatory behavior and the ways that technology could be used to facilitate criminal activity. Several universities established research programs focused on understanding how predators adapt to technological changes and developing countermeasures to prevent technology-enabled victimization. Dr. Richardson's continued study of the Hutchins case led to the publication of a comprehensive book that became a standard reference in criminal psychology and law enforcement training programs. Predators of the Open Road, Technology, Isolation, and the Evolution of Rural Crime provided detailed analysis of the case and its implications for understanding modern predatory behavior. The Hutchins case represents a watershed moment in our understanding of how predators can exploit both technology and geography to create new forms of victimization. Dr. Richardson wrote in his conclusion, "Be combined with physical isolation to create unprecedented opportunities for harm." The book became required reading in criminal justice programs throughout the United States and was translated into several languages for international law enforcement training. The case study methodology developed for analyzing the Hutchins investigation became a model for examining other complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes involving technology and organized predatory behavior. Years after Hutchins' conviction and execution, the case continued to influence law enforcement practices and rural safety awareness throughout Texas and beyond. Annual training conferences included sessions on recognizing and investigating technology-enabled predatory behavior, and new officers received specialized instruction in the vulnerabilities that rural areas presented to both criminals and law enforcement. Sheriff Delacroix, even in retirement, remained active in these educational efforts. His unique perspective as the lead investigator in the case made him a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences and community safety meetings. He often emphasized that the most important lesson from the case was the need for constant adaptation and awareness in rural law enforcement. Bobby Ray Hutchins succeeded for as long as he did because he understood our weaknesses better than we understood them ourselves, Delacroix would tell audiences. He knew our response times, our communication limitations, our assumptions about rural crime. The only way to prevent future predators like him is to constantly examine and address those weaknesses, even when it's uncomfortable or expensive to do so. The memorial established for Hutchins' victims became a place of pilgrimage for families affected by similar crimes and a symbol of the importance of remaining vigilant about rural safety. Located at the Texas State Capitol, the memorial includes the names of all confirmed victims and a commitment to continue working to identify and apprehend predators who target travelers in rural areas. Each year, on the anniversary of Patricia Kellum's rescue, law enforcement agencies throughout Texas participate in Operation Safe Passage, a coordinated effort to increase patrols on rural highways, conduct safety checkpoints at rest areas and truck stops, and distribute traveler safety information to the public. The operation serves both as a practical crime prevention measure and as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance. The livestock roads of rural Texas continue to serve their original purpose, connecting ranches and communities across vast distances under the endless sky. But they do so now with the understanding that beauty and danger can coexist in the same landscape, and that the price of rural safety is the same as safety anywhere else. Constant awareness, community cooperation, and the wisdom to know that not every offer of help comes from a good Samaritan. For those who knew the victims, for the law enforcement officers who worked the case, and for the communities that were forever changed by the revelation of systematic predation in their midst, the Hutchins case serves as a permanent reminder that evil can adapt to any environment, and that the vigilance required to maintain safety must be as persistent as the threats it seeks to counter. The story of Bobby Ray Hutchins and his reign of terror on the livestock roads of Texas will be remembered not just as a crime story, but as a turning point in rural America's understanding of safety, technology, and the complex relationship between isolation and vulnerability. It stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to accept easy explanations for complex crimes, and to the resilience of communities that learned to balance traditional hospitality with modern awareness of the dangers that can hide behind a friendly face and an offer of assistance. In the end, the most lasting legacy of the case may be the understanding that rural America, like every other part of the modern world, must constantly evolve its approaches to safety and security in response to evolving threats. The livestock roads remain as beautiful and essential as ever, but they are traveled now by people who understand that preparation, awareness, and community support are not signs of paranoia, but essential elements of responsible rural living. The cattle still move along these ancient paths, following routes established by generations of ranchers who understood the land and its rhythms. But their movement is now observed by law enforcement officers who know that predators, too, can learn to follow established patterns, and that the price of keeping rural America safe is the willingness to remain always watchful, always prepared, and always ready to protect those who travel through the vast, beautiful, and occasionally dangerous landscape that defines the heart of Texas. Sheriff Rebecca Martinez had always believed that the worst corruption in law enforcement happened in big cities, where millions of dollars in drug money and organized crime created temptations that small-town officers would never face. After 18 years serving Cottonwood County, Texas, a rural jurisdiction of 12,000 residents spread across 800 square miles of ranch land and oil fields, she thought she understood the limits of rural crime. Cattle rustling, domestic violence, the occasional meth lab hidden in an abandoned farmhouse. Simple crimes with simple motives, investigated by officers who knew every family in the county, and whose biggest ethical challenge was avoiding conflicts of interest in a community where everyone was related by blood or marriage. That comfortable assumption died on a cold February morning in 2020, when Martinez received a phone call that would ultimately expose a conspiracy of corruption, murder, and cover-up spanning 3 decades and reaching into the highest levels of county government. "Sheriff, we got a problem out at the old Morrison place." Deputy Jake Wilson's voice crackled through the radio, his usual steady professionalism replaced by something that sounded like barely controlled panic. "You need to get out here right now, and Sheriff, you might want to call the state police. This is bigger than anything we can handle." The Morrison property sat 15 miles northeast of Cottonwood, the county seat, on a section of land that had been in the same family since the 1890s. Edgar Morrison had been the county's most successful rancher until his death 3 years earlier, leaving behind a sprawling operation that included 5,000 acres of grazing land, oil and gas leases worth millions, and enough political influence to have 3 county commissioners and a state legislator as regular guests at his annual barbecue. Sheriff Martinez had known Edgar personally. He'd been one of her early supporters when she ran for office, contributing generously to her campaign and vouching for her qualifications with voters who weren't sure they wanted a female sheriff. His death from a heart attack at age 78 had been mourned throughout the county, and his funeral had drawn politicians and business leaders from across East Texas. Now, apparently, something had been discovered on Edgar's former property that had reduced Deputy Wilson, a 15-year veteran of the department, to near panic. Martinez drove through the crisp February morning, past dormant cotton fields and cattle pastures where Angus and Hereford cattle clustered around stock tanks and hay feeders. The landscape was brown and stark in winter, but she could see the subtle green beginning to show in the grass where warmer temperatures were encouraging new growth. This was her county. Every road and landmark familiar after nearly 2 decades of patrolling its boundaries. The Morrison Ranch House sat on a slight rise overlooking a creek bottom where massive cottonwood trees provided shade in summer and shelter for cattle in winter. It was a substantial structure built in the 1940s, white limestone with a red tile roof and a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Edgar's widow had moved to a retirement community in Tyler after his death, and the property was being prepared for sale by the family's attorney. Deputy Wilson met Martinez at the front gate, his face pale despite the cool morning air. Behind him, she could see crime scene tapes stretched around a large area behind the house, and the distinctive white van of the county coroner parked near what appeared to be a construction site. "What do we have, Jake?" Martinez asked, noting the way her deputy's hands shook slightly as he consulted his notepad. "Family hired a contractor to install a swimming pool behind the house. Wilson explained, his voice tight. They were excavating for the foundation when they hit something about 4 feet down. Contractor thought it was an old septic system at first, so he called the health department to check on permits. Health inspector took one look and called us. And it's not a septic system, Sheriff. It's a burial site. Multiple victims. Looks like they've been there for years, maybe decades. Martinez felt that familiar cold sensation in her stomach that came with cases that were about to get complicated in ways she couldn't yet imagine. How many? Coroner's still working, but initial examination suggests at least 6 individuals, adults and children. And Sheriff Wilson paused, looking even more uncomfortable. There's something else. The contractor found this buried with the remains. He handed Martinez a sealed evidence bag containing a small metal object that made her blood run cold. It was a badge, tarnished with age, but still clearly identifiable as belonging to the Cottonwood County Sheriff's Department. The badge number was 0003, which Martinez recognized immediately. It had belonged to Thomas Brennan, Edgar Morrison's brother-in-law, who had served as sheriff from 1985 to 1998. Jesus Christ, Martinez whispered, staring at the badge that represented not just evidence of murder, but the first indication that the corruption she was about to uncover reached into the very heart of her department's history. The crime scene behind the Morrison house was unlike anything Martinez had encountered in her career. The excavation had revealed what appeared to be a carefully constructed burial site, with remains arranged in a systematic pattern that suggested deliberate planning rather than hasty disposal. Dr. Sarah Chen, the county medical examiner, was working methodically to document and recover the remains while preserving as much forensic evidence as possible. Initial examination suggests these individuals died at different times over a period of several years, Dr. Chen reported as Martinez surveyed the scene. The varying states of decomposition and different burial techniques indicate this site was used repeatedly, probably over a decade or more. Any indication of cause of death? Too early to say definitively, but I'm seeing evidence of trauma on several of the remains. Gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma. These people didn't die from natural causes. Martinez organized a systematic search of the entire Morrison property, bringing in additional resources from the Texas Rangers and the State Crime Lab. The investigation expanded beyond the initial burial site, as ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in several other locations around the ranch. Over the next 3 days, the search uncovered 2 additional burial sites containing a total of 11 more bodies. The victims ranged in age from children to elderly adults, and preliminary examination suggested they had been killed over a period spanning from the late 1980s to the early 2000s. The systematic nature of the burials and the location on one of the county's most prominent properties indicated a level of organization and protection that could only have been possible with law enforcement involvement. The discovery of Sheriff Brennan's badge among the remains was the first piece of evidence directly linking the murders to official corruption, but it was far from the last. As forensic investigators processed the crime scenes, they found additional items that painted a disturbing picture of law enforcement complicity in systematic murder. A second badge, this one belonging to Deputy Chief Ray Patterson, who had served under Brennan throughout the 1990s. An evidence bag containing driver's licenses from victims, stamped with the official seal of the Cottonwood County Sheriff's Department. Most damning was a handwritten log, preserved in a waterproof container, that documented dates, names, and what appeared to be payment amounts associated with each burial. "This isn't random violence," Martinez told the Texas Ranger captain who was now leading the investigation. "This is organized crime with law enforcement protection. Someone was using the sheriff's department to facilitate murder, and Edgar Morrison's ranch as a disposal site." Captain David Rodriguez, a 30-year veteran of complex rural investigations, reviewed the evidence with the grim expression of someone who had seen similar cases before. "Pattern suggests contract killings," he observed. "Victims from out of county, systematic disposal, careful record keeping. Someone was running a murder-for-hire operation and using official law enforcement resources to cover it up." The investigation into the Morrison Ranch murders transformed Cottonwood County from a quiet rural community into the center of a statewide corruption probe. The Texas Rangers established a task force specifically dedicated to examining decades of suspicious deaths, missing persons cases, and unexplained disappearances that might be connected to the conspiracy. Martinez found herself in the unprecedented position of investigating her own department's history. Reviewing case files and incident reports dating back to the 1980s, with the knowledge that some of her predecessors had been involved in systematic murder. The psychological impact was devastating. Every case, every decision, every official action taken by the department during those years was now suspect. "I've been carrying on the work of murderers," she confided to her husband during one of the many sleepless nights that followed the discovery. "Every tradition, every procedure, every relationship in this department was potentially contaminated by what they were doing." The task force began by creating a comprehensive database of all deaths, disappearances, and missing persons cases in Cottonwood County and surrounding areas during the period when the murders appeared to have taken place. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and horrifying. A steady stream of people who had vanished without adequate investigation, cases that had been closed prematurely, and deaths that had been ruled accidental or natural despite questionable circumstances. Dr. Martinez, a forensic anthropologist brought in from the University of Texas to assist with victim identification, made discoveries that expanded the scope of the investigation even further. "These remains show evidence of professional disposal techniques," she reported during a briefing with the task force. "The systematic arrangement, the use of lime to accelerate decomposition, the careful selection of burial sites. Someone with knowledge of forensic investigation was working to make these bodies difficult to find and identify." The victim identification process revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The bodies found at the Morrison Ranch included missing persons from 5 different states, all of whom had disappeared while traveling through East Texas during the 1990s and early 2000s. Business travelers, families on vacation, individuals relocating for jobs, all had vanished without trace in what had been dismissed as routine missing persons cases. But the most shocking discovery came when forensic investigators identified one of the child victims. 8-year-old Maria Santos had been reported missing from a rest stop near the Louisiana border in 1995. Her family had been traveling from California to visit relatives in Mississippi when she disappeared, while her parents were inside paying for gas. The case had received national media attention, with extensive searches conducted by multiple law enforcement agencies. The Santos case was one of the biggest investigations in East Texas history, Captain Rodriguez explained during a press conference. Hundreds of officers, volunteers, and federal agents spent months searching for this child. The fact that she was buried on Edgar Morrison's ranch, less than 20 miles from where she disappeared, indicates a level of law enforcement involvement that goes beyond simple corruption into active participation in murder. The revelation that Maria Santos had been killed and buried by the very officers who had pretended to search for her sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across Texas. The case became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of public trust, with officers using their positions not just to commit crimes, but to cover up those crimes by leading fake investigations designed to misdirect attention from their own involvement. Martinez ordered a complete review of all evidence from the Santos case, including witness statements, search records, and communication logs. The review revealed a pattern of misdirection and delay that now appeared deliberate rather than incompetent. Key search areas had been inexplicably excluded from systematic coverage. Witness reports of suspicious vehicles near the rest stop had been dismissed without adequate follow-up. Most damning radio communications from the day Maria disappeared showed Sheriff Brennan personally directing search efforts away from the Morrison Ranch area, claiming it had already been thoroughly checked. "They didn't just kill that little girl," Martinez said during an emotional briefing with her current deputies. "They tortured her family for months by pretending to look for her, knowing exactly where she was the entire time." The investigation into the Santos murder led to the identification of additional victims and the gradual reconstruction of how the conspiracy had operated. The pattern that emerged showed a sophisticated criminal organization that had used the sheriff's department as both a source of victims and a means of avoiding prosecution. Sheriff Brennan and his associates had apparently been targeting travelers passing through Cottonwood County, using traffic stops and other official contacts to identify individuals who were carrying large amounts of cash, had minimal local connections, or whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. Victims were then killed, their bodies disposed of at the Morrison Ranch, and their property stolen and sold through a network of accomplices. The Morrison Ranch had been the perfect disposal site, remote enough to avoid accidental discovery, but under the protection of the county's most influential citizen, and the sheriff who was his brother-in-law. Edgar Morrison's political connections had ensured that the property was never subjected to the kind of official scrutiny that might have revealed the buried remains. Deputy Chief Patterson, whose badge had been found with the remains, had apparently been the operational leader of the conspiracy. Interviews with retired officers revealed that Patterson had controlled evidence processing, managed case assignments, and coordinated with Morrison to schedule burials when the ranch was free of workers or visitors. Patterson was the one who decided which cases got serious investigation and which ones were allowed to go cold, explained retired Deputy Martha Collins during an interview with the task force. If someone disappeared, and Patterson said they probably just moved on or went back where they came from, that was the end of it. Nobody questioned his judgment. The financial component of the conspiracy began to emerge as investigators examined bank records, property transactions, and unexplained wealth accumulation by the involved officers. Sheriff Brennan had purchased the expensive boat and vacation home in Arkansas during the 1990s, acquisitions that were inconsistent with his official salary. Patterson had invested in rental properties and a small trucking company, using cash transactions that avoided normal banking scrutiny. Edgar Morrison's role appeared to extend beyond simply providing burial sites. Financial analysis revealed regular cash payments from Morrison to both Brennan and Patterson, disguised as consulting fees for ranch security services. The payments correlated with the timing of burials, suggesting that Morrison was not just facilitating the murders, but actively financing them. Morrison wasn't just a passive accomplice, Agent Torres from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit explained during a briefing. He was essentially operating a murder-for-hire business, using corrupt law enforcement to provide both victims and protection from investigation. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as investigators traced connections between the Morrison Ranch murders and similar cases in neighboring counties. The pattern extended across East Texas, with evidence of coordination between corrupt officers in multiple jurisdictions to facilitate interstate murder and robbery operations. Sheriff Martinez faced the devastating realization that her department had been compromised for decades, with traditions and procedures established during the Brennan era continuing to influence operations long after the principal conspirators had died or retired. The institutional culture of the department had been shaped by murderers, creating blind spots and practices that had persisted even after honest officers took control. Every time we followed department tradition, or used procedures established during the Brennan years, we were potentially perpetuating a system designed to facilitate murder, Martinez reflected during a television interview. The corruption wasn't just individual, it had become institutional. The psychological impact on current department members was severe. Officers who had joined the force after Brennan's retirement discovered that their training had been provided by people who were either involved in the conspiracy or unknowingly perpetuating practices established by murderers. The pride they had taken in carrying on department traditions was replaced by horror at what those traditions actually represented. Deputy Wilson, who had discovered the initial burial site, requested transfer to another department after learning that his field training officer had been Ray Patterson's protege. I can't tell which parts of my training came from legitimate law enforcement and which parts were designed to help cover up murders, he explained in his transfer request. The community impact was equally devastating. Cottonwood County residents discovered that their most trusted public officials had been systematic murderers, using their positions to prey on vulnerable travelers while maintaining facades of respectability and public service. The annual barbecue at Edgar Morrison's ranch, attended by hundreds of community leaders, had been held on ground that contained the bodies of murder victims. Local business leaders who had been Morrison's friends and political allies found themselves under scrutiny for possible knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy. The county commissioner, who had been Morrison's closest political associate, was arrested when investigators discovered he had helped arrange fake bills of sale for stolen vehicles belonging to murder victims. Mayor Patricia Gonzalez, whose family had been friends with the Morrisons for 3 generations, struggled with the revelation that her childhood memories of pleasant visits to the ranch were connected to a site of systematic murder. I played in those fields where they buried those people, she said during a town hall meeting. My children had birthday parties at that house. How do you process something like that? The investigation revealed that the conspiracy had extended into multiple areas of county government. The county judge who had overseen Morrison's estate after his death had been involved in covering up financial irregularities that were now understood to be connected to the murder operation. The district attorney who had prosecuted cases during the Brennan era had been suspiciously ineffective in cases involving serious crimes that might have exposed the conspiracy. Dr. Richardson, the forensic psychiatrist who had studied the earlier Hutchins case, was brought in to help understand the psychology of institutional corruption on the scale revealed in Cottonwood County. His analysis revealed how corruption could become self-perpetuating within small organizations where personal relationships and shared secrets created powerful incentives for continued participation. The Morrison Ranch conspiracy represents a perfect storm of rural corruption, Dr. Richardson explained during a presentation to law enforcement professionals. Small departments with limited oversight, powerful local figures with economic and political influence, and a closed community culture that discourages questioning authority figures. Once the conspiracy was established, it became nearly impossible for honest officers to challenge it without destroying their careers and potentially their lives. The investigation also revealed the vulnerability of travelers in rural areas where corrupt law enforcement could operate with impunity. The victims of the Morrison Ranch murders had been selected specifically because they were outsiders with limited local connections, making them perfect targets for officers who could control the investigation of their own crimes. Patricia Kellum, whose experience as a victim in the earlier Hutchins case had made her an advocate for travelers' safety, testified before the Texas legislature about the systemic vulnerabilities that both cases had exposed. Rural travelers face unique risks because they depend entirely on local law enforcement for protection, she explained. When that law enforcement is compromised, travelers become prey rather than protected citizens. The Morrison Ranch case prompted comprehensive reforms in rural law enforcement oversight and accountability. The Texas legislature passed the Rural Law Enforcement Transparency Act, requiring increased reporting and external oversight for small departments, particularly in cases involving missing persons and suspicious deaths. New protocols were established for investigating missing persons cases involving out-of-county victims, with mandatory notification of state authorities and requirements for independent review of cases that were closed without resolution. The reforms were designed to prevent the kind of systematic misdirection that had allowed the Morrison conspiracy to operate for decades. The property where the murders had taken place became the center of intense legal battles. Morrison's heirs attempted to distance themselves from the crimes, claiming they had no knowledge of their relatives' involvement in murder. However, financial analysis revealed that the family had benefited from the conspiracy through inflated land values and oil lease payments that were now understood to have been funded partially through murder proceeds. The state of Texas eventually seized the Morrison Ranch through asset forfeiture proceedings, arguing that the property had been used as an instrument of ongoing criminal enterprise. The legal precedent established by the seizure expanded law enforcement's ability to pursue assets connected to systematic corruption and murder. Victim families filed civil lawsuits against Morrison's estate, Cottonwood County, and other entities that had benefited from or facilitated the conspiracy. The lawsuits revealed additional details about the scope of the operation and the extent to which it had been protected by corruption throughout the local legal system. Maria Santos's parents, who had spent 25 years not knowing what had happened to their daughter, became the most visible advocates for justice and reform. Their lawsuit against Cottonwood County resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement and established new protocols for missing children cases that required independent oversight and regular review by state authorities. "We trusted the system to find our daughter," Maria's father testified during court proceedings. "We never imagined that the people we were trusting had killed her and were laughing at us while we begged them for help." The emotional testimony from victim families had a profound impact on the community, forcing residents to confront not just the fact that murders had occurred, but that they had been perpetrated by people they had trusted and respected. The psychological processing of such systematic betrayal took years and required professional counseling services for many residents. Sheriff Martinez implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future corruption and rebuild community trust in law enforcement. The department adopted new transparency measures, including body cameras for all officers, GPS tracking for all vehicles, and mandatory reporting of all contacts with out-of-county individuals. A civilian oversight board was established with authority to review all suspicious death and missing persons cases. The board included members from outside Cottonwood County to ensure independence from local political and social pressures that had facilitated the original conspiracy. "We had to essentially rebuild the department from the ground up," Martinez explained during a national conference on rural law enforcement reform. "Every procedure, every tradition, every relationship had to be examined and either reformed or eliminated. It was like performing surgery on ourselves while trying to continue providing public safety services." The rebuilding process was complicated by the need to maintain community safety while investigating and reforming the very institution responsible for providing that safety. Martinez had to balance the need for thorough investigation with the practical requirement of keeping deputies on patrol and responding to emergencies. Several veteran officers chose early retirement rather than undergo the intensive background investigations and psychological evaluations required for all department members. The exodus of experienced personnel created operational challenges, but also opportunities to establish new cultures and practices based on legitimate law enforcement principles rather than criminal conspiracy. The recruitment of new officers was particularly challenging, as qualified candidates were reluctant to join a department with such a tainted history. Martinez had to travel throughout Texas to find officers willing to transfer to Cottonwood County, often accepting lower salaries and dealing with community suspicion as a part of the rebuilding process. Training new officers required developing entirely new curricula that emphasized ethical decision-making, transparency, and accountability. The traditional field training programs that had been used for decades were abandoned in favor of approaches developed by police academies and departments with strong reputations for integrity. The community healing process was equally complex and ongoing. Town hall meetings were held regularly to discuss the investigation's progress and allow residents to express their feelings about the betrayal they had experienced. Mental health services were expanded to help people process the trauma of learning that their most trusted public officials had been systematic murderers. Religious leaders throughout the county struggled with their own connections to the conspiracy. Several pastors had been close friends with Edgar Morrison and had blessed the annual barbecues that were now understood to have been held on burial grounds. The spiritual dimensions of such systematic evil challenged theological understandings and required extensive counseling and prayer for many community members. The annual Morrison Barbecue, which had been a highlight of the county's social calendar for decades, was permanently discontinued. The site where it had been held was eventually converted into a memorial garden for the victims of the conspiracy, providing a place for reflection and remembrance rather than celebration. Economic impacts of the scandal were significant and long-lasting. Property values throughout the county declined as the national media attention made Cottonwood County synonymous with corruption and murder. Businesses dependent on outside customers, such as restaurants and motels, saw reduced patronage as people avoided the area. The oil and gas industry, which provided significant tax revenue for the county, was affected as companies became reluctant to invest in an area with such negative publicity. Several lease agreements were terminated or not renewed, creating budget challenges for county government that persisted for years. Tourism, which had been a growing part of the local economy based on the area's historical sites and outdoor recreation opportunities, virtually disappeared as potential visitors associated the county with murder and corruption rather than scenic beauty and rural hospitality. Recovery efforts focused on demonstrating that the county had learned from the scandal and implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent future corruption. A new economic development strategy emphasized transparency, accountability, and ethical governance as key selling points for potential investors and visitors. The Texas Rangers maintained a permanent presence in Cottonwood County for several years after the initial investigation, providing oversight and assistance as the local department rebuilt itself. The Rangers' involvement helped restore some community confidence in law enforcement while ensuring that reforms were properly implemented and maintained. Federal involvement in the case continued for years as investigators worked to identify additional victims and trace the full extent of the criminal network. The FBI's involvement brought resources and expertise that were essential for unraveling decades of systematic corruption and murder. Interstate cooperation became crucial as investigators discovered that the Morrison Ranch conspiracy had connections to similar operations in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. The network of corrupt law enforcement officers had apparently extended across state lines, facilitating the movement of victims and the disposal of evidence. The conviction of surviving conspirators was complicated by the passage of time and the death of key participants. Sheriff Brennan had died of natural causes in 2010, taking his secrets with him to the grave. Edgar Morrison's death in 2017 had eliminated the conspiracy's central figure before his role could be fully investigated. Ray Patterson, the former deputy chief whose badge had been found with the remains, was still alive but suffering from advanced dementia that made prosecution impossible. His condition prevented him from standing trial, but also meant that crucial information about the conspiracy's operations might never be recovered. 3 surviving accomplices were eventually convicted on various charges related to the conspiracy. County Commissioner Frank Torres received a life sentence for his role in facilitating murders and covering up evidence. Former District Attorney Robert Mills was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Deputy Sheriff James Crawford, who had been Patterson's protege, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The trials revealed additional details about the conspiracy's operations, but also highlighted how much information had been lost due to the deaths of key participants and the passage of time. Many questions about specific victims and the full scope of the operation remained unanswered, creating ongoing frustration for victim families and investigators. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of the remains continued for years after their initial discovery, as new techniques and technologies allowed for more detailed examination of evidence. Advanced DNA analysis led to the identification of additional victims and provided crucial evidence for the prosecutions of surviving conspirators. The scientific investigation became a case study in forensic anthropology and archaeology, with the techniques developed for the Morrison Ranch excavations being adopted by investigators working on similar cases throughout the United States. The systematic approach to recovering and analyzing decades-old remains set new standards for handling complex burial sites. Academic researchers from multiple universities studied the Morrison Ranch case as an example of institutional corruption and its long-term effects on communities. The case became a standard example in criminal justice programs, illustrating how corruption could become self-perpetuating within small organizations with limited external oversight. The psychological research conducted on the case revealed new insights into how communities process massive betrayals of trust by authority figures. The long-term effects on community cohesion, civic engagement, and trust in institutions provided valuable information for other communities dealing with similar scandals. Sheriff Martinez's leadership during the investigation and rebuilding process became a model for other law enforcement executives dealing with inherited corruption. Her approach of complete transparency, systematic reform, and community engagement was studied and emulated by departments throughout the United States. The Morrison Ranch case taught us that corruption isn't just about individual bad actors, Martinez reflected during a presentation to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's about systems and cultures that allow corruption to flourish. Preventing future corruption requires not just punishing individual officers, but fundamentally changing the institutional environment that made their crimes possible. The memorial established for the victims of the Morrison Ranch conspiracy became a place of pilgrimage for families affected by similar crimes, and a symbol of the importance of maintaining vigilance against corruption in all its forms. The memorial includes the names of all identified victims and a commitment to continue working to identify those who remain unknown. Each year, on the anniversary of the discovery of the burial sites, Cottonwood County holds a memorial service that includes not just remembrance of the victims, but renewed commitment to the principles of transparency, accountability, and ethical governance that the reforms were designed to establish. Law enforcement agencies throughout Texas participate in annual training exercises based on lessons learned from the Morrison Ranch case. The exercises focus on recognizing signs of institutional corruption, maintaining ethical standards under pressure, and protecting vulnerable populations from predatory law enforcement officers. The case continues to influence law enforcement practices and community oversight throughout rural America. New officers receive training on the Morrison Ranch case as an example of how corruption can develop and persist within small departments, and how individual officers have responsibilities to report and resist unethical practices. The landscape of Cottonwood County remains much the same as it was before the scandal. Rolling hills covered with cattle pastures and oil derricks, small towns connected by farm-to-market roads, communities where everyone knows everyone else. But the social fabric of the county was permanently altered by the revelation that systematic murder had been committed by the very people entrusted with protecting public safety. The Morrison Ranch House was eventually demolished, its limestone blocks used to construct the foundation of the county's new emergency services center. The symbolism was intentional, using materials from a site of corruption to build a facility dedicated to honest public service and community protection. The cottonwood trees that gave the county its name still line the creeks and provide shade for cattle during hot summer days. But they also serve as reminders of how deeply rooted corruption can become, and how much effort is required to dig it out and replace it with something healthy and beneficial to the community. For Sheriff Martinez, who continued serving Cottonwood County through the most difficult period in its history, the Morrison Ranch case represents both the worst betrayal of public trust imaginable and proof that communities can recover from even the most systematic corruption if they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to genuine reform. The case stands as a permanent reminder that the price of honest government is constant vigilance, not just by law enforcement professionals, but by the communities they serve. The citizens of Cottonwood County learned that democracy requires active participation and oversight, even when, especially when, it means questioning the integrity of people they want to trust. In the end, the Morrison Ranch murders revealed that corruption is not just a failure of individual character, but a systemic problem that requires systematic solutions. The reforms implemented in Cottonwood County serve as a model for other rural communities seeking to prevent the kind of institutional corruption that can transform law enforcement from protectors into predators. The story of the Morrison Ranch conspiracy will be remembered not just as a crime story, but as a lesson in how communities can be betrayed by those they trust most, and how they can recover from that betrayal through commitment to transparency, accountability, and the principles of democratic governance that make honest law enforcement possible. Today, travelers passing through Cottonwood County see a landscape that appears peaceful and prosperous, with well-maintained farms and friendly small towns that embody the best of rural Texas values. What they don't see is the extensive work that went into rebuilding trust, reforming institutions, and ensuring that the corruption that once flourished there can never take root again. The memorial to the victims of the Morrison Ranch murders stands as a permanent reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the most dangerous threats to public safety sometimes come not from criminals operating outside the law, but from those who corrupt the law itself for their own evil purposes. The cottonwood trees continue to grow along the creeks of the county that bears their name, their deep roots a symbol of both the persistence of corruption and the possibility of renewal when communities commit themselves to justice, truth, and the protection of the innocent. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell had always prided himself on knowing every family, every business, and every potential source of trouble in Piney Woods County, Texas. In his 22 years of law enforcement in the East Texas timber country, he had dealt with moonshiners hiding stills in the dense forests, drug runners using logging roads to transport contraband, and the occasional domestic dispute that turned violent. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the phone call that came on a humid September evening in 2018. A call that would expose a religious cult so deeply embedded in his community that its influence reached into the sheriff's department itself. Sheriff Caldwell, this is Deputy Sarah Morrison. The voice on the radio was tight with controlled panic. I'm out at the old lumber camp off Highway 259, about 12 miles north of town. We got a situation here that, sir, I think you need to see this personally. And Sheriff, you might want to call the Texas Rangers. This is something way beyond what we can handle. Piney Woods County sat in the heart of East Texas, where towering pine forests stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by small logging communities, Baptist churches, and the occasional oil derrick. The county seat of Millerville had a population of just under 8,000, surrounded by vast stretches of timberland owned by paper companies and managed through a network of logging operations that had sustained the region's economy for over a century. The old lumber camp that Deputy Morrison had referenced was one of dozens scattered throughout the county. Abandoned facilities left behind when mechanization had reduced the need for the large crews that once harvested timber by hand. Most of these camps had been deserted for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, visited only by hunters, teenagers looking for isolated places to party, and the occasional law enforcement officer checking for illegal activities. Sheriff Caldwell drove through the gathering dusk, his headlights cutting through the shadows cast by towering pines that lined Highway 259. The road was narrow and winding, with dense forest pressing close on both sides, creating a tunnel effect that made even experienced locals feel claustrophobic. He had been down this particular road hundreds of times over the years, but tonight something felt different. An atmosphere of tension that seemed to emanate from the woods themselves. The turnoff to the lumber camp was barely visible, marked only by a weathered sign that read, "Pine Ridge Logging, Private Property." Caldwell followed the rutted dirt road for nearly 2 miles through increasingly dense forest before emerging into a clearing where the remains of the old logging operation were scattered like the bones of some industrial dinosaur. Deputy Morrison met him at the edge of the clearing, her usually composed demeanor replaced by visible agitation. Behind her, Sheriff Caldwell could see crime scene tapes stretched around what appeared to be the camp's main bunkhouse, and several other deputies standing guard over an area that seemed to contain more activity than an abandoned lumber camp should generate. "What do we have, Sarah?" Caldwell asked, noting the way his deputy's hands trembled slightly as she consulted her notepad. "Anonymous tip came in about 3 hours ago," Morrison reported, her voice carefully controlled. "Caller said there were people living out here who weren't supposed to be here, and that we should check the main bunkhouse for evidence of illegal activities. When I arrived to investigate, I found, well, you need to see it for yourself." The bunkhouse was a substantial log structure that had once housed dozens of loggers during the camp's operational years. It should have been empty, filled with nothing but dust, wildlife, and the detritus left behind by decades of abandonment. Instead, Sheriff Caldwell found clear evidence that the building had been occupied recently, and not by squatters or transients looking for temporary shelter. The interior of the bunkhouse had been extensively modified, with new partition walls creating smaller rooms, modern electrical wiring running along the ceiling, and what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation system that had been carefully concealed from external view. The main common area had been converted into something resembling a chapel or meeting hall, with rough wooden benches arranged in concentric circles around a raised platform that held a lectern and several religious symbols that Caldwell didn't immediately recognize. "How many people were living here?" Caldwell asked, noting the evidence of recent habitation. Personal belongings, food supplies, bedding arranged in the smaller rooms. "Based on the sleeping arrangements and personal items, looks like maybe 20 to 30 individuals," Morrison replied. "Men, women, and children. But Sheriff, that's not the disturbing part. Look at this." She led him to a room in the back of the bunkhouse that had been set up as some kind of office or record-keeping center. The walls were covered with photographs, charts, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance information about residents of Millerville and surrounding communities. Names, addresses, family relationships, work schedules, financial information, and personal habits were meticulously documented on dozens of families throughout Piney Woods County. "They've been watching us," Morrison said, pointing to a chart that included information about the sheriff's department itself. Look here, they have duty rosters, patrol schedules, personal information about every deputy. They know more about our operations than some of our own officers do. Sheriff Caldwell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature as he examined the surveillance materials. The level of detail was extraordinary. Photographs taken with telephoto lenses, detailed notes about daily routines, financial records that could only have been obtained through illegal means. Most disturbing was a series of documents that appeared to be psychological profiles of community leaders, law enforcement officers, and prominent families with notations about potential vulnerabilities and methods of influence. This isn't just surveillance, Caldwell realized. This is intelligence gathering for some kind of operation. They've been planning something that requires detailed knowledge of everyone in the community. The investigation expanded rapidly as additional evidence was discovered throughout the lumber camp. A second building had been converted into what appeared to be a communal kitchen and dining facility, with supplies sufficient to feed a large group for an extended period. A third structure contained what looked like a combination armory and medical facility, with stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies that suggested preparation for either extended isolation or armed conflict. Most unsettling was the discovery of a buried communications center, hidden beneath a false floor in one of the smaller buildings. The facility contained sophisticated radio equipment capable of monitoring law enforcement communications, intercepting cell phone calls, and maintaining contact with other locations across multiple states. The equipment was professional grade, far beyond what might be expected for an isolated religious community. Whoever was running this operation had serious resources and technical expertise, observed Captain David Rodriguez of the Texas Rangers, who arrived at the scene within hours of Sheriff Caldwell's call for assistance. This isn't a group of religious extremists hiding in the woods. This is an organized operation with significant funding and advanced capabilities. The abandoned lumber camp was processed as a crime scene, with forensic teams working to document evidence and gather intelligence about the group that had been operating there. The level of organization and preparation they discovered painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that had been years in the planning and implementation. Analysis of the surveillance materials revealed that the group had been monitoring Piney Woods County residents for at least 2 years, gathering information that could be used for blackmail, manipulation, or recruitment. The psychological profiles were particularly disturbing, showing detailed analysis of individual weaknesses, fears, and motivations that could be exploited by skilled manipulators. They weren't just watching people randomly, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Jennifer Walsh during a briefing with local law enforcement. They were conducting systematic intelligence gathering designed to identify individuals who could be recruited, coerced, or eliminated based on their potential threat to whatever the group was planning. The religious symbols found throughout the camp were analyzed by experts in cult behavior and extremist groups. The symbols combined elements from various traditions, Christian mysticism, New Age spirituality, and some iconography that appeared to be unique to this particular group. The mixture suggested a syncretic belief system designed to appeal to people from different religious backgrounds while maintaining central control through a charismatic leader. Classic cult recruitment and control techniques, Dr. Walsh explained. They create a belief system that incorporates familiar elements from mainstream religions while adding unique aspects that can only be understood through the group's leadership. This makes members feel special and chosen, while making it difficult for them to maintain connections with outside religious communities. The search for the cult members who had been living at the lumber camp became a priority for law enforcement agencies throughout East Texas. The sophisticated nature of their operation and the level of intelligence they had gathered about local communities suggested they posed a significant threat to public safety, whether through direct violence or more subtle forms of manipulation and coercion. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis of documents found at the camp revealed connections to a registered religious organization called the Whispering Pines Collective, which had been operating legally in Piney Woods County for over 3 years. The organization had been granted tax-exempt status as a religious group and had maintained a public face through a small church in Millerville and various community service activities. They were hiding in plain sight, Sheriff Caldwell realized as he reviewed the documentation, running a legitimate religious organization as a front while conducting intelligence operations and planning whatever they were really up to. The Whispering Pines Collective had been led by a charismatic preacher named Samuel Wright, who had arrived in Millerville in 2015 and quickly established himself as a respected member of the religious community. Wright had been involved in interfaith activities, community service projects, and had even provided chaplain services for the sheriff's department during times of crisis. "He was at my daughter's wedding," Sheriff Caldwell told the investigative team, his voice heavy with the realization of how thoroughly he and his community had been deceived. "Gave the blessing at our annual law enforcement memorial service. I trusted him with some of the most important moments in our community's life." The investigation into Samuel Wright revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation and deception spanning multiple states and decades. Wright was actually Samuel Morrison, a former military intelligence officer who had been discharged under suspicious circumstances in 2010. After leaving the military, he had used his intelligence training to establish and lead various religious groups that served as fronts for criminal activities. Wright specialized in what we call deep infiltration, explained FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who had been tracking Morrison's activities across several states. He would establish legitimate religious organizations in rural communities, build trust and relationships over several years, then use that position to gather intelligence for various criminal purposes. Previous investigations had linked Morrison to identity theft rings, financial fraud schemes, and at least one case of systematic blackmail of community leaders. His method was always the same: establish a religious organization, become a trusted community leader, gather compromising information about residents, then exploit that information for criminal gain before disappearing and starting over in a new location. The lumber camp operation was his most sophisticated yet, Agent Torres continued. Instead of just gathering information for immediate criminal exploitation, he was building a long-term intelligence network that could support much larger operations. The search for Morrison and his followers intensified as law enforcement agencies recognized the potential threat posed by a cult leader with military intelligence training and access to advanced surveillance equipment. The group's sudden disappearance from the lumber camp suggested they had been warned about the investigation, raising concerns about possible informants within local law enforcement or government. The breakthrough came when analysis of the communications equipment revealed regular contact with similar groups in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. The network appeared to be part of a larger organization that was coordinating activities across multiple states, sharing intelligence and resources to support operations that individual cells couldn't accomplish alone. "We're not dealing with an isolated cult," Captain Rodriguez reported to a joint task force of federal and state investigators. "This is a network of organized groups using religious cover to conduct intelligence operations, recruit followers, and prepare for some kind of coordinated action across the rural South." The investigation revealed that the Whispering Pines Collective was part of what Morrison called the New Covenant Network. a loose confederation of religious groups that shared an apocalyptic belief system centered on the coming collapse of the United States government and the need for true believers to establish independent communities that could survive the chaos. The network's ideology combined religious extremism with anti-government sentiment, survivalist philosophy, and elaborate conspiracy theories about government surveillance and control. Morrison preached that mainstream society was corrupt and doomed, and that only those who joined his network and followed his leadership would survive the coming catastrophe. Classic cult indoctrination techniques combined with military-style organization and planning, Dr. Walsh explained during a briefing on the network's operations. Morrison was preparing his followers for what he described as a holy war against corrupt government and society, but he was also using them to gather intelligence and resources that could be exploited for criminal purposes. The network's financial operations were particularly sophisticated, involving multiple shell companies, charitable organizations, and investment schemes that generated revenue while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious activities. Morrison had been particularly skilled at identifying and recruiting individuals with valuable skills: accountants, technology specialists, former military personnel, who could contribute to the network's operations. He didn't just recruit followers, Agent Torres observed. He recruited assets, people who could provide specific capabilities that the network needed to achieve its goals. The manhunt for Morrison and his followers led to a series of raids on properties across 4 states, revealing the true scope of the new Covenant network. Law enforcement agencies discovered weapons caches, surveillance equipment, and detailed plans for what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of domestic terrorism targeting government facilities and law enforcement agencies. The plans revealed Morrison's ultimate goal: to provoke a violent government response that would validate his apocalyptic prophecies and trigger a broader uprising by anti-government groups throughout the rural South. The intelligence gathered in communities like Millerville was intended to identify targets, assess security vulnerabilities, and predict law enforcement responses to various scenarios. Morrison was essentially planning to start a civil war, Captain Rodriguez explained during a press conference. He believed that if he could provoke the right kind of government response, it would trigger the collapse he was predicting and allow his network to seize control of rural areas. The arrests began with raids conducted simultaneously across multiple states, targeting known network facilities and safe houses. Morrison himself was captured at a compound in rural Arkansas, along with nearly 60 followers who had been living in conditions that combined religious communalism with military-style discipline. The compound where Morrison was arrested contained evidence of extensive preparation for armed conflict, including weapons training facilities, communications equipment, and detailed maps of government facilities throughout the region. Followers had been organized into cells with specific responsibilities: intelligence gathering, recruitment, logistics, and what Morrison euphemistically called direct action. The level of organization was extraordinary, reported ATF Special Agent Michael Chen, who led the raid on the Arkansas compound. These weren't just religious extremists with guns. They were trained, disciplined, and prepared to carry out sophisticated operations against multiple targets. The arrest of Morrison and his key lieutenants disrupted the network's immediate plans, but investigators discovered that the organization had been designed to continue operating even if its leadership was compromised. Autonomous cells throughout the region had been given independent missions and resources, creating the potential for ongoing terrorist activities even after Morrison's capture. The investigation into the network's activities in Piney Woods County revealed the extent to which Morrison had infiltrated local institutions and relationships. Several prominent community members had been recruited as informants or collaborators, providing the cult with inside information about law enforcement activities, government operations, and community vulnerabilities. Sheriff Caldwell faced the devastating realization that his department had been compromised by the very people they had trusted as community partners and spiritual advisors. Morrison had used his position as a religious leader to gain access to sensitive information about law enforcement operations, emergency response procedures, and personal details about officers and their families. He knew things about our department that only insiders should know, Caldwell reflected during a debriefing with federal investigators. Response times, patrol routes, personal information about deputies and their families. He had been gathering intelligence for years while we thought he was helping us serve the community. The psychological impact on community members who had been involved with the Whispering Pines Collective was severe and long-lasting. Many had genuinely believed they were participating in a legitimate religious organization focused on community service and spiritual growth. The revelation that they had been manipulated by a domestic terrorist organization left them struggling with feelings of betrayal, shame, and fear. Dr. Margaret Santos, a psychologist specializing in cult recovery, was brought in to provide counseling services for former members and community members affected by the network's activities. Her assessment revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques Morrison had used to recruit and control followers. Morrison was extremely skilled at identifying people's vulnerabilities and crafting personalized approaches to recruitment, Dr. Santos explained during a community meeting. He didn't just target isolated or unstable individuals. He specifically sought out competent, skilled people who could contribute to his organization while maintaining their positions in mainstream society. The recruitment process had typically begun with seemingly innocent invitations to community service projects or interfaith activities. Morrison would gradually introduce potential recruits to increasingly radical ideas while providing emotional support, spiritual guidance, and a sense of belonging to a special group with important purposes. Classic cult recruitment progression, Dr. Santos continued. Start with legitimate activities that appeal to people's better angels. Gradually introduce more extreme ideas while increasing social isolation from outside influences. Then commit people to increasingly serious actions that make it difficult to leave the group. Many followers had been unaware of the network's criminal activities or terrorist plans, believing they were participating in legitimate religious and community activities. The compartmentalized structure of the organization meant that only Morrison's inner circle knew the full scope of the operation. The legal proceedings against Morrison and his associates revealed additional details about the network's activities and long-term plans. Morrison was eventually convicted on federal terrorism charges, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal weapons possession, and numerous financial crimes. His sentence of life without parole reflected the seriousness of the threat his organization had posed to public safety. Several of his lieutenants received lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy, while many rank-and-file followers received shorter sentences or probation in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. The legal process took several years and required extensive resources from multiple law enforcement agencies. The trials provided a comprehensive look at how domestic terrorist organizations could operate within rural communities, using religious cover and social manipulation to build support networks while preparing for violent action against government targets. The evidence presented during the proceedings became a valuable resource for law enforcement agencies working to identify and counter similar threats. Community recovery from the Morrison cult infiltration was a long and difficult process that required extensive external support and internal soul-searching. Residents of Piney Woods County had to confront the reality that they had been systematically deceived and manipulated by people they had trusted as spiritual leaders and community partners. It changed how we think about trust and community, explained Mayor Patricia Williams during a town hall meeting held 6 months after Morrison's arrest. We had to learn the difference between being welcoming to newcomers and being naive about people's true intentions. The county implemented new procedures for vetting organizations seeking to establish religious or community service operations, including background checks on leadership and ongoing monitoring of activities. While these measures were sometimes criticized as intrusive or discriminatory, most residents supported them as necessary precautions against future infiltration. Sheriff Caldwell instituted comprehensive reforms within his department to prevent future compromise by hostile organizations. New protocols required multiple layers of approval for sharing sensitive information with outside parties, and regular security assessments were implemented to identify potential vulnerabilities. We learned that community policing and openness, while essential for effective law enforcement, also create opportunities for sophisticated adversaries, Caldwell explained during a law enforcement conference. The key is finding the right balance between accessibility and security. The physical sites used by the Morrison Network were carefully processed for evidence and then secured or demolished to prevent their use by other criminal organizations. The lumber camp where the investigation began was eventually purchased by the county and converted into a training facility for emergency responders, symbolically transforming a site of planned terrorism into a resource for community protection. The Whispering Pines Church building in Millerville was sold and converted into a community center, with the proceeds used to fund counseling services for people affected by the cult's activities. The transformation of the building from a site of deception into a genuine community resource helped residents reclaim their sense of safety and trust. Federal agencies used the Morrison case to develop new training programs for local law enforcement on recognizing and countering domestic terrorist infiltration of rural communities. The case became a standard example of how sophisticated adversaries could exploit the openness and trust that characterized small-town America. The Morrison Network succeeded because they understood rural community culture and exploited our strengths against us, explained FBI Special Agent Torres during a presentation to rural sheriffs. Our hospitality, our respect for religious belief, our assumption that people who help in the community have good intentions, all of these positive qualities were weaponized by a domestic terrorist organization. The training programs emphasize the importance of maintaining community openness while developing reasonable safeguards against infiltration and manipulation. Law enforcement officers learn to recognize signs of intelligence gathering, unusual interest in sensitive information, and attempts to build inappropriate relationships with law enforcement personnel. Religious communities throughout East Texas also had to grapple with the implications of the Morrison case for their own organizations and activities. Many churches and religious groups implemented new policies for background checking leaders, monitoring financial activities, and maintaining transparency in their operations. The Morrison case forced all of us to think more carefully about accountability and oversight within religious organizations, explained Reverend James Patterson, president of the East Texas Ministerial Alliance. We had to find ways to protect against infiltration and manipulation while preserving the spiritual freedom and autonomy that are essential to religious life. The broader implications of the case extended into discussions about domestic terrorism, religious extremism, and the vulnerabilities of rural communities to sophisticated criminal organizations. Academic researchers studied the case as an example of how modern terrorist groups could adapt traditional cult recruitment and control techniques for political purposes. Dr. Richardson, the forensic psychiatrist who had analyzed previous cases, conducted an extensive study of the Morrison Network's psychological manipulation techniques. His research revealed how military intelligence training could be adapted for cult leadership and domestic terrorism operations. Morrison represents a new category of domestic terrorist, Dr. Richardson wrote in his published analysis. He combined the psychological manipulation techniques of cult leaders with the organizational skills of military intelligence officers and the ideological framework of anti-government extremists. This combination made him extraordinarily dangerous and difficult to detect. The study became required reading in law enforcement academies and provided valuable insights for agencies working to counter domestic terrorism threats. The psychological profiles developed during the investigation helped identify warning signs of similar operations and recruitment patterns. The Morrison case also influenced federal policy on monitoring domestic extremist groups and provided justification for increased resources dedicated to countering domestic terrorism. The revelation that such a sophisticated network could operate undetected for years in rural America prompted comprehensive reviews of intelligence gathering and threat assessment procedures. Years after Morrison's conviction, the effects of his network's activities continued to influence life in Piney Woods County. The community had become more cautious about newcomers and more vigilant about protecting sensitive information. Changes that some residents viewed as unfortunate but necessary adaptations to modern security realities. "We lost some of our innocence," reflected longtime resident Maria Gonzalez during an interview on the 5th anniversary of Morrison's arrest. "We used to assume that people who came here with religious missions or community service goals had good intentions. Now, we ask more questions and verify more carefully before we trust." The economic impact of the case was mixed. While the negative publicity initially hurt tourism and business development, the county's reputation for effective law enforcement response and comprehensive security reforms eventually attracted new residents and businesses who valued the community's commitment to safety and security. The annual memorial service for victims of domestic terrorism, established after the Morrison case, became an important community event that brought together law enforcement, religious leaders, and residents to remember the lessons learned and renew commitments to vigilance and mutual protection. Sheriff Caldwell continued serving Piney Woods County until his retirement in 2023, but the Morrison case remained the defining experience of his career. His leadership during the investigation and community recovery process earned recognition from law enforcement organizations throughout Texas and provided a model for other rural sheriffs dealing with similar threats. The Morrison case taught us that rural America isn't immune from sophisticated criminal threats, Caldwell reflected during his retirement ceremony. But it also showed that our communities have the strength and resilience to overcome those threats when we work together with determination and courage. The forests of Piney Woods County remain much as they were before the Morrison infiltration, towering pines stretching to the horizon, logging roads winding through deep woods, small communities connected by bonds of mutual dependence and shared values. But the social landscape was forever changed by the revelation that domestic terrorists had lived among them, gathering intelligence and preparing for violence while wearing the masks of religious devotion and community service. The abandoned lumber camps scattered throughout the county's forests serve as reminders of both the area's industrial heritage and its vulnerability to those who would exploit its isolation and trust for criminal purposes. Most have been secured or demolished, but a few remain as training sites for law enforcement and emergency responders, their conversion from potential terrorist bases to community protection resources symbolizing the county's recovery and renewed vigilance. Today, visitors to Piney Woods County see a community that appears peaceful and prosperous, with well-maintained churches, active civic organizations, and residents who embody the best traditions of rural Texas hospitality. What they don't see is the extensive network of security measures, intelligence sharing protocols, and community awareness programs that help protect against future infiltration by hostile organizations. The story of Samuel Morrison and the Whispering Pines Collective serves as a permanent reminder that the qualities that make rural communities strong, trust, hospitality, respect for privacy, and assumption of good intentions, can also make them vulnerable to sophisticated predators who understand how to exploit those qualities for criminal purposes. The case stands as testimony to the importance of balancing openness with vigilance, hospitality with security, and trust with verification. The residents of Piney Woods County learned that protecting their way of life requires constant awareness of those who would destroy it, and that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In the end, the Morrison case revealed that domestic terrorism is not just an urban phenomenon or a problem for federal agencies, but a threat that can emerge in any community where conditions allow sophisticated criminals to operate undetected. The response of Piney Woods County, swift, comprehensive, and focused on both justice and recovery, provides a model for other rural communities facing similar challenges. The whispering pines that give the county its character continue to grow tall and straight, their voices in the wind carrying both the memories of those who were deceived and the determination of those who refuse to be deceived again. They stand as living symbols of a community's resilience and its commitment to protecting the values and freedoms that define rural America at its best. The psychological aftermath of the Morrison cult infiltration continued to affect Piney Woods County residents for years after the initial arrests and trials. Dr. Santos established a long-term counseling program that addressed not just the immediate trauma of deception, but the ongoing challenges of rebuilding trust within a community that had been systematically manipulated by people they had considered spiritual leaders and friends. The hardest part for many survivors wasn't the initial shock of discovery, Dr. Santos explained during a presentation to mental health professionals studying cult recovery. It was the ongoing process of questioning every relationship, every memory, every decision they had made during the period of infiltration. People had to rebuild their entire understanding of who they could trust and how they could protect themselves from future manipulation. The recovery process was complicated by the fact that Morrison's network had been so thoroughly integrated into community life. Former cult members had to continue living and working alongside people who had been targets of their intelligence-gathering operations. Neighbors who had been surveilled had to interact daily with people who had participated in that surveillance, even if unwittingly. Sarah Mitchell, a local schoolteacher who had been recruited into the Whispering Pines Collective through her involvement in community service projects, struggled with the realization that she had unknowingly provided information about students and families that had been incorporated into the cult's surveillance files. "I thought I was helping build stronger community connections," Sarah explained during a support group meeting. "When Samuel asked me about families who might be struggling financially or socially, I thought he was trying to identify people who could benefit from church assistance. I never imagined he was building intelligence files on vulnerable targets." The discovery that seemingly innocent conversations and community activities had been used to gather intelligence created a climate of suspicion and second-guessing that persisted long after Morrison's arrest. Residents found themselves analyzing past interactions, wondering what information they might have inadvertently provided and how it might have been used against them or their neighbors. The children, who had been part of families involved with the Whispering Pines Collective, faced particular challenges in processing their experiences. Many had been exposed to the group's extremist ideology during what they thought were normal religious education activities. Separating legitimate spiritual teachings from the apocalyptic and anti-government propaganda they had absorbed required specialized counseling approaches. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a child psychologist brought in to work with affected families, developed new therapeutic protocols specifically for children who had been exposed to domestic terrorist ideology disguised as religious education. His work became a model for other communities dealing with similar situations. Children are particularly vulnerable to this type of manipulation because they naturally trust adult authority figures and accept what they're taught as truth, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Morrison's group was particularly insidious because they mixed legitimate religious concepts with extremist ideology in ways that made it difficult for children to distinguish between the two. The educational impact on local schools was significant, as teachers and administrators had to develop new approaches to identify and address the effects of extremist indoctrination on students. Several children displayed behavioral changes, inappropriate knowledge of weapons and violence, and concerning attitudes toward government and law enforcement that had been shaped by their exposure to the cult's ideology. The school district implemented new training programs for teachers and staff to recognize signs of extremist influence and provide appropriate support for affected students. The programs emphasized the importance of creating safe spaces where children could express their confusion and fears without judgment, while receiving accurate information to counter the propaganda they had absorbed. The investigation into the new Covenant Network's activities revealed connections to similar groups operating throughout the rural United States, part of a broader movement of anti-government extremism that had been growing in response to social and economic changes in rural America. Morrison's network was identified as one of the most sophisticated examples of how extremist groups were adapting their recruitment and operational strategies to exploit the vulnerabilities of small communities. Federal intelligence agencies expanded their monitoring of domestic extremist groups to include more systematic tracking of religious organizations that might be serving as fronts for terrorist activities. The Morrison case provided a template for identifying warning signs of extremist infiltration and developing countermeasures to protect vulnerable communities. The Department of Homeland Security established new programs to help rural law enforcement agencies recognize and respond to sophisticated infiltration attempts. Sheriff Caldwell became a frequent instructor in these programs, sharing lessons learned from the Piney Woods County experience with law enforcement officers throughout the country. The Morrison case showed us that domestic terrorists aren't just angry individuals with guns, Caldwell explained during a training session for rural sheriffs. They can be highly trained, well-funded organizations with sophisticated capabilities for intelligence gathering, psychological manipulation, and long-term operational planning. We have to be prepared to recognize and counter threats that are much more complex than traditional rural crime. The financial investigation into Morrison's network revealed a sophisticated funding structure that involved multiple legitimate businesses, investment schemes, and charitable organizations. The network had generated millions of dollars in revenue through various legal and illegal activities, using the money to purchase weapons, equipment, and property while maintaining the appearance of modest religious communities. IRS investigators discovered that Morrison had exploited numerous tax benefits available to religious organizations while using the funds for criminal purposes. The investigation led to significant reforms in how religious organizations were monitored and audited, with new requirements for financial transparency and accountability. The asset forfeiture proceedings following Morrison's conviction resulted in the seizure of properties, vehicles, and financial accounts across multiple states. The recovered assets were used to compensate victims of the network's activities and fund new programs for preventing and responding to domestic terrorist infiltration of rural communities. The media coverage of the Morrison case brought national attention to the vulnerabilities of rural communities to sophisticated criminal infiltration. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and academic researchers descended on Piney Woods County to study how the network had operated undetected for so long and what lessons could be learned for protecting other communities. The attention was both beneficial and challenging for the community. While the coverage helped raise awareness about domestic terrorism threats and led to increased resources for rural law enforcement, it also created ongoing scrutiny and sometimes sensationalized portrayals of events that made recovery more difficult for some residents. Mayor Williams worked with media outlets to ensure that coverage focused on the community's response and recovery rather than just the sensational aspects of the cult's activities. Her efforts helped shape public understanding of the case as a story of resilience and effective law enforcement, rather than just a tale of deception and extremism. We didn't want to be known forever as the place where domestic terrorists operated, Williams explained. We wanted to be known as the community that identified the threat, responded effectively, and implemented measures to prevent it from happening again. The international implications of the Morrison case emerged as investigators discovered connections between the new Covenant network and extremist groups in other countries. The network had been part of a broader movement of rural extremism that was coordinating activities across national boundaries, sharing tactics and resources to support anti-government activities in multiple countries. Intelligence agencies in Canada, Australia, and several European countries reported similar patterns of religious extremist groups infiltrating rural communities and gathering intelligence for potential terrorist activities. The Morrison case became a model for international cooperation in countering domestic terrorism threats that operated across national boundaries. The academic study of the Morrison case contributed to new theories about how extremist movements adapt to changing social and technological conditions. Researchers identified the network's use of religious cover and community infiltration as representing an evolution in domestic terrorism tactics that was likely to become more common as traditional approaches became less effective. Dr. Richardson's continued research into the case revealed new insights into the psychology of extremist leadership and the methods used to recruit and control followers in rural communities. His work contributed to the development of new therapeutic approaches for cult survivors and more effective techniques for preventing extremist recruitment. Morrison represents a new generation of domestic terrorist leader, Dr. Richardson wrote in a follow-up study published 5 years after the initial case. He combined traditional cult leadership techniques with modern intelligence methods and extremist ideology to create an organization that was far more dangerous and sophisticated than previous domestic terrorist groups. The long-term law enforcement response to the Morrison case included the establishment of permanent task forces dedicated to monitoring domestic extremism in rural areas. These task forces combined federal resources with local expertise to identify and counter sophisticated infiltration attempts before they could become operational threats. Sheriff Caldwell's department became a model for rural law enforcement agencies, seeking to balance community engagement with security awareness. The protocols developed in Piney Woods County were adopted by sheriff's departments throughout Texas and other states as standard procedures for protecting against extremist infiltration. The training programs that emerged from the case emphasized the importance of maintaining community relationships while developing skills to recognize manipulation and deception. Officers learned to distinguish between legitimate religious and community activities and potentially harmful extremist operations disguised as benevolent organizations. The technological aspects of the Morrison Network's surveillance and communication capabilities led to new research into countering electronic surveillance and protecting privacy in rural communities. The sophisticated equipment found at the lumber camp demonstrated that domestic terrorist groups had access to professional-grade intelligence gathering tools that were previously associated only with foreign intelligence operations. Cybersecurity experts worked with rural law enforcement agencies to develop new protocols for protecting sensitive communications and detecting unauthorized surveillance activities. The programs included training for officers and community leaders on recognizing signs of electronic surveillance and implementing countermeasures to protect sensitive information. The agricultural and forestry industries that dominated Piney Woods County's economy had to adapt to new security realities revealed by the E. Morrison case. Large landowners and timber companies implemented new procedures for monitoring remote properties and screening individuals seeking access to isolated areas that could serve as bases for extremist operations. The Lumber Industry Association developed new guidelines for managing abandoned facilities and monitoring remote properties to prevent their use by criminal organizations. The guidelines included regular inspections, improved security measures, and coordination with law enforcement to identify and investigate suspicious activities. The religious community's response to the Morrison case involved comprehensive self-examination and reform efforts designed to prevent future infiltration by extremist groups. Churches and religious organizations throughout East Texas implemented new policies for screening leaders, monitoring activities, and maintaining transparency in their operations. The East Texas Ministerial Alliance established new protocols for welcoming and evaluating religious leaders who were new to the community. The protocols included background checks, references from previous communities, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that new religious leaders were genuinely committed to legitimate spiritual work rather than extremist activities. The Morrison case forced all of us to think more carefully about how we evaluate and trust religious leaders, explained Reverend Patterson. We had to find ways to maintain our openness to new spiritual voices while protecting our communities from those who would exploit our faith for criminal purposes. The educational institutions in Piney Woods County implemented new curricula designed to help students develop critical thinking skills about extremist ideology and manipulation techniques. The programs were designed to protect young people from recruitment by extremist groups while respecting religious freedom and encouraging legitimate spiritual exploration. The University of Texas established a research center dedicated to studying rural extremism and developing countermeasures to protect vulnerable communities. The center used the Morrison case as a foundational study for understanding how extremist groups adapt their tactics to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of rural America. Graduate students in criminology, psychology, and public policy conducted ongoing research into various aspects of the case, contributing to a growing body of academic literature on domestic terrorism, cult psychology, and rural security issues. The research helped inform policy decisions and law enforcement practices throughout the country. The Morrison case influenced federal legislation designed to address the growing threat of domestic terrorism in rural communities. The Rural Security Enhancement Act provided funding for improved law enforcement training, community awareness programs, and technological resources to help rural areas protect against sophisticated criminal infiltration. The legislation also established new requirements for federal agencies to share intelligence about domestic extremist groups with local law enforcement, improving coordination between different levels of government in countering terrorist threats. The improved information sharing helped prevent other extremist groups from establishing operations similar to Morrison's network. The international law enforcement community studied the Morrison case as an example of how domestic terrorist groups were evolving their tactics and strategies. Training programs for police and security agencies in multiple countries incorporated lessons learned from the Piney Woods County experience, helping to prevent similar infiltrations in other rural communities worldwide. The case became a standard example in international conferences on domestic terrorism, cult behavior, and rural security issues. Law enforcement professionals from around the world visited Piney Woods County to study the community's response and recovery efforts, creating lasting relationships that enhanced international cooperation in countering extremist threats. The memorial established for the community's recovery from the Morrison infiltration became a pilgrimage site for other communities dealing with similar challenges. The memorial included not just remembrance of those who were deceived and harmed, but celebration of the community's resilience and commitment to protecting democracy and religious freedom from extremist exploitation. The annual memorial service grew into a regional event that brought together law enforcement officials, religious leaders, community activists, and researchers from throughout the South. The service combined remembrance of the past with renewal of commitments to vigilance and mutual protection against future threats. The economic recovery of Piney Woods County was aided by its reputation for effective response to security threats and comprehensive reform efforts. Communities developed security protocols and training programs. Tourism eventually recovered and even increased as people became interested in visiting a community that had successfully confronted and overcome a major domestic terrorism threat. The story of Piney Woods County's resilience and recovery became part of its identity and attraction for visitors interested in rural American history and culture. The environmental impact of the Morrison Network's activities was another long-term concern that required ongoing attention. The group had established hidden facilities and buried communications equipment throughout the forest, creating potential environmental hazards that had to be identified and remediated. Environmental cleanup efforts revealed the extent to which the network had modified and potentially contaminated natural areas throughout the county. The cleanup process took several years and required specialized expertise in dealing with electronic waste, chemical contamination, and restoration of disturbed forest areas. The cleanup efforts became opportunities for community engagement and environmental education, with local schools and volunteer organizations participating in restoration projects that helped heal both the land and the community's relationship with the forest that had been exploited by the extremist network. Sheriff Caldwell's leadership during the Morrison case and its aftermath established him as a national expert on rural security issues and domestic terrorism prevention. He authored several books on the subject, contributed to academic research, and served as a consultant to law enforcement agencies throughout the country. His memoir, Betrayed Trust, A Sheriff's Account of Domestic Terrorism in Rural America, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that brought national attention to the challenges facing rural law enforcement in an era of sophisticated criminal threats. The Morrison case taught me that being a rural sheriff in the modern era requires skills and knowledge that previous generations never needed, Caldwell wrote in his memoir. We have to be prepared to counter threats that are as sophisticated as anything faced by urban departments, while maintaining the community relationships and personal connections that are essential to rural law enforcement. The legacy of the Morrison case continued to influence law enforcement practices and community safety initiatives throughout Texas and beyond. New officers received training on the case as part of their academy education, ensuring that future generations of law enforcement professionals understood the lessons learned and the ongoing vigilance required to protect rural communities. The case files and evidence from the Morrison investigation were preserved as a permanent resource for researchers, law enforcement trainers, and policymakers studying domestic terrorism and rural security issues. The comprehensive documentation of the network's activities and the community's response provided invaluable data for understanding and countering similar threats. The community of Piney Woods County eventually found ways to incorporate the lessons of the Morrison case into its ongoing identity and culture. The experience of confronting and overcoming a sophisticated domestic terrorism threat became a source of pride and strength, demonstrating the resilience and effectiveness of rural American communities when faced with existential challenges. The forests that had once hidden extremist training camps and surveillance equipment were restored to their natural state and returned to their traditional uses for recreation, timber production, and wildlife habitat. but they remained symbols of both vulnerability and resilience, reminding residents that constant vigilance was the price of maintaining their way of life. The whispering pines continued to grow, their voices in the wind now carrying not just the sounds of nature, but the collective memory of a community that had faced its darkest hour and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to protecting the values and freedoms that define rural America at its best. Their whispers spoke of lessons learned, vigilance maintained, and determination to ensure that the trust and openness that make rural communities strong would never again be exploited by those who sought to destroy what they could not understand or control. The story of Samuel Morrison and the Whispering Pines Collective became more than just a crime story or a tale of law enforcement success. It became a testament to the strength of American democracy and the resilience of communities that refuse to surrender their values to extremism, regardless of the sophisticated masks that extremism might wear. The pines whispered of victory over those who would destroy from within, and of the eternal vigilance required to keep that victory secure for future generations.